She signed away her life on a Tuesday night while lightning split the sky over Manhattan. Not for money, not for power, for the only person she had left worth saving. But the man sitting across from her, the one with dead eyes and a $2 billion empire, he wasn't offering salvation. He was offering a cage dressed in silk. And the worst part? She walked into it willingly. What she didn't know yet was that the cage would break him long before it ever broke her. If you want to know how a marriage built on lies became the most devastating love story I've ever told, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to where it all started. The law office smelled like old leather and someone else's cologne, and Celine Vale sat in a chair that cost more than 3 months of her rent, trying to keep her hands from shaking. She wasn't doing a great job of it. Across the conference table, Caspian Mercer didn't look at her. He looked through her the way people look through glass, through waitresses, through anyone who exists below the line their money draws across the world. His suit was charcoal. His tie was black. His face could have been cut from the same stone they used to build the building, and his eyes carried the flat, clinical emptiness of a man who had long ago decided that feeling things was a waste of his time. Rain hammered the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. 47 stories below, Manhattan blurred into streaks of yellow and white light, and the thunder came in low, rattling the water glasses on the table like a warning nobody was going to hear. Celine heard it. She just didn't care anymore. Her brother was dying. That was the only fact that mattered. Everything else, pride, dignity, the churning nausea climbing her throat, was noise. Background static, the kind of thing you learn to swallow when the person you love most in the world is 17 years old and hooked up to machines that beep in rhythms you start hearing in your sleep. Liam, 17, leukemia. The aggressive kind, the kind that doesn't negotiate, the kind that eats through a body the way fire eats through paper. Fast, indifferent, and total. The experimental treatment existed. That was the cruel part. It wasn't some fantasy, some miracle cure whispered about in desperate forums at 3 in the morning. It was real. It was happening in a trial program at Mount Sinai, and it cost more money than Celine would make in 6 lifetimes working double shifts at the restaurant where she'd been grinding herself to dust since she was 19. So when the offer came, absurd, clinical, insulting, she didn't laugh. She listened. The terms are straightforward, Caspian said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that fills a room without rising. 12 months. Public appearances as required. Residence at my address. Full cooperation with media positioning around the Ashford-Mercer acquisition. He slid a folder across the table. Cream-colored, heavy paper. The kind of stationery that whispers money even before you read the words printed on it. In exchange, your brother receives full enrollment in the NovaCure trial program. All medical expenses covered. Post-treatment care included. If complications arise, secondary specialists will be retained at my cost. Celine stared at the folder. Her jaw was tight, her eyes burned. She hadn't slept in 31 hours, and the coffee she'd forced down in the lobby was sitting in her stomach like acid. "Why me?" she asked. Caspian's expression didn't change. "You fit the profile." The profile. Age appropriate. No significant public history, no criminal record, no existing relationship that would complicate the narrative. He paused. "You're also not famous enough for anyone to question the timeline." Celine let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "So I'm nobody. That's the qualification." Anonymity is an asset in this case. And what's your asset? What do you get out of pretending to be married to a waitress from Queens? For the first time, something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth, not offense. Something closer to calculation. The micro-adjustment of a man who was used to controlling every variable in every room he entered. "The Ashford board has concerns about stability," he said. "Personal stability. The merger requires confidence from conservative stakeholders who believe that a married CEO presents a lower risk profile than one who—" He stopped. Recalibrated. "The optics matter. That's all you need to understand." "That's all I need to understand," Celine repeated flatly. "Yes." She looked at him, really looked, and saw something she would spend months trying to forget. Behind the expensive suit and the granite composure and the brutal efficiency of his language, Caspian Mercer was hollow. Not cruel, not evil, just empty. like someone had opened him up years ago, removed something essential, and stitched him back together with nothing but discipline and money to fill the gap. She should have run. "Where do I sign?" she said. The pen was heavy, silver, engraved with initials she didn't recognize. Her hand was steady when she signed, which surprised her because everything inside her chest was collapsing. Thunder cracked outside, loud enough to rattle the windows, and Celine Vale stopped being herself and became someone else entirely. Mrs. Caspian Mercer. A fiction. A transaction. A lie with a 12-month expiration date. 3 days later, she stood inside his penthouse with a single suitcase and the distinct feeling that she had made either the bravest or the stupidest decision of her life. The place was enormous, obscenely enormous. 3 floors of marble, glass, and silence perched on top of the Upper East Side like a monument to the idea that money could replace every human need. The living room alone was bigger than the entire apartment she shared with her mother in Astoria, and it was filled with the kind of furniture that looked designed to be admired, never touched. No family photos, no books left open on a table, no coffee mug in the sink, no shoes kicked off by the door, no evidence whatsoever that a living, breathing person had ever existed inside these walls. Celine set her suitcase down in the hallway and stood there, listening. Silence. Not peaceful silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a home at rest. This was the silence of something sealed, a vacuum, a tomb, a place where sound went to die. "Your room is on the 2nd floor," said a voice behind her. She turned. A woman in her 50s, sharp-eyed and impeccably dressed, stood at the edge of the hallway with a tablet in her hand. "I'm Margaret, Mr. Mercer's household manager. Your closet has been stocked per the style guidelines outlined in Appendix C of your agreement. If you need alterations, submit requests by Thursday each week. Breakfast is available between 6 and 8. Mr. Mercer does not take breakfast." "Style guidelines," Celine said. "Appendix C." "There's an appendix about my clothes." Margaret's expression didn't shift. "There are 7 appendices. I suggest you review them." Celine opened her mouth, closed it, picked up her suitcase and climbed the stairs alone. The bedroom was beautiful in the way that hotel rooms are beautiful. Flawless, impersonal, and aggressively empty. A king-size bed with white linens. A window that overlooked Central Park. A closet the size of her old kitchen, filled with dresses and coats and shoes that still had tags on them, every single one in her size, every single one chosen by someone who had never met her and never would. She sat on the edge of the bed, pressed her palms flat against her thighs, and breathed. In, out. In, out. She thought about Liam, about the way he'd looked the last time she'd visited. Thin, gray, with bruises under his eyes that made him look 50 instead of 17. She thought about the sound of his voice when he'd told her, trying to be brave, that it was okay if the treatment didn't work out, that he'd had a good run. A good run. 17 years old, a good run. Celine pressed her fist against her mouth and didn't cry. She had decided 3 days ago that she was done crying. Crying didn't pay medical bills. Crying didn't keep her brother alive. She unpacked her suitcase, hung up her own clothes next to the ones that had been chosen for her, and went downstairs to face her new life. The first 2 weeks were a masterclass in loneliness. Caspian was a ghost in his own home. He left before dawn and returned after midnight, and on the rare occasions their schedules overlapped, he moved through the penthouse like a man walking through a space that existed only to serve a function. Kitchen for coffee, study for calls. Bedroom? His bedroom, on the 3rd floor, as far from hers as architecturally possible, for whatever approximation of rest a person like him allowed themselves. They spoke in fragments, logistics, schedules, the bare minimum required to maintain the illusion they were building for the world outside these walls. "There's an event Saturday," he said one morning, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat already on. "The Whitfield Foundation Gala. A car will pick you up at 7. Margaret will brief you on the guest list." "Good morning to you too," Celine said from the kitchen island, where she was eating toast she'd made herself because the idea of requesting breakfast through a household manager made her feel like she was losing her mind. Caspian paused, looked at her. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or the faint recognition that he was interacting with a human being and not a line item on a spreadsheet. "Good morning," he said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. Then he left. The gala was her first test, and Selene almost failed it. The Whitfield Foundation event was held at the Plaza, a ballroom full of crystal chandeliers, champagne that cost more per glass than she made in a day, and 300 people who all seemed to know each other in the effortless, territorial way that old money knows itself. Selene wore a deep emerald gown from Appendix C. Her hair was done by someone Margaret had arranged. Her makeup was flawless, her posture was perfect, and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Caspian appeared beside her as their car pulled up, and for the first time she saw him in full performance mode. The transformation was terrifying. The cold, robotic man from the penthouse vanished. In his place stood someone charming, magnetic, almost warm, a version of Caspian Mercer designed specifically for public consumption. He placed his hand on the small of her back as they entered. He leaned close to whisper things that weren't funny, but made her smile because the proximity of his breath on her ear sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. He introduced her to people whose names she immediately forgot, his hand never leaving her waist, his attention never wavering from her face. "You're doing fine," he murmured at one point, and the fact that he noticed she was struggling made her angrier than anything else he'd done. She didn't want his reassurance. She wanted this year to be over. But halfway through the night, something happened that lodged itself in her chest like a splinter. A woman approached them near the bar. Tall, blonde, the kind of beauty that looks calculated, every angle considered, every detail deliberate. She smiled at Caspian with an intimacy that made Celine's stomach drop, and when she spoke, her voice carried the texture of a shared history. "Caspian, it's been ages." "Victoria." His tone didn't change, but his hand tightened on Celine's waist. The pressure was slight, involuntary almost, but Selene felt it like a jolt. "And this must be the wife everyone's buzzing about." Victoria turned to Selene with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Selene, is it? I have to say, nobody saw this coming. Caspian Mercer, settling down. You must be quite something." There was a challenge in her voice, a dare. Selene recognized it because she'd grown up in Queens, where women tested each other with exactly this kind of precision, just with fewer diamonds and cheaper drinks. "I'm nothing special," Selene said. "Just lucky, I guess." Victoria's smile tightened. "Luck. Right." After she walked away, Selene looked at Caspian and saw something she hadn't expected. His jaw was locked. His eyes were tracking Victoria across the room with an expression that wasn't attraction. It was closer to dread. "Old friend?" Selene asked carefully. "No," Caspian said, and the word was a door slamming shut. They drove home in silence. He disappeared into his study. She went upstairs, unzipped the emerald dress, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her underwear, staring at her own reflection like she was trying to remember who she was underneath the costume. She didn't find an answer that night. The first crack appeared 3 weeks in. Selene couldn't sleep. Jet lag from a time zone her body had never left, just the internal clock of a person wound too tight, and she wandered downstairs at 2 a.m. to get water. The study door was open. She almost walked past it. Almost. But the sound stopped her, a sharp, bright crack followed by the unmistakable tinkle of breaking glass. She pushed the door open. Caspian was standing beside his desk, his right hand bleeding, a shattered whiskey tumbler in fragments on the hardwood floor. The room smelled like bourbon and fury. His hair was disheveled, his tie was gone, his shirt was untucked, and the look on his face was something Selene had never seen on him before. Pain. Raw, unprocessed animal pain. The kind that lives in the body because the mind refuses to carry it. He looked at her, and for one naked second, she saw everything he spent every waking hour trying to hide. Then the mask came back, fast and hard, like a steel gate dropping. "Go back to bed," he said. Selene looked at his hand. Blood ran between his fingers and dripped steadily onto the floor. A piece of glass was embedded in his palm. "You're bleeding. I'm aware. You need I need you to go back to bed." She should have listened. Any rational person operating within the terms of a business contract would have turned around, walked upstairs, and filed the incident under "not my problem." Selene went to the kitchen, found a clean towel, came back. He hadn't moved. Blood pooled on the floor at his feet. His breathing was controlled, too controlled, the kind of breathing that takes effort, the kind that holds everything else at bay. "Sit down," she said. "This isn't—" "Sit down, Caspian." Maybe it was the use of his first name. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that he'd been standing alone in a dark room at 2 a.m, bleeding, and she was the first person in God knew how long who had bothered to walk through the door. He sat. Celine knelt in front of him, took his hand in both of hers, and carefully pulled the glass from his palm. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just watched her with those unreadable eyes while she wrapped the towel around his hand and applied pressure. "You should see a doctor," she said. "It's a cut. It's a deep cut. I've had worse." She looked up at him. Their faces were close, closer than they'd ever been outside of a performance. She could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the slight crookedness of his nose that suggested it had been broken once, the dark circles under his eyes that no amount of expensive grooming could fully conceal. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Something moved in his jaw. A muscle, a decision, a war between honesty and habit. "Nothing," he said. "A bad night." She didn't push. She finished wrapping his hand, stood up, and went to get a broom for the glass. When she came back, he was still sitting there, looking at the blood on the floor like it belonged to someone else. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded like they had been dragged from somewhere deep and reluctant, somewhere that hadn't produced gratitude in a very long time. Celine swept up the glass without answering. When she left, she closed the door behind her softly and stood in the dark hallway with her back against the wall, her heart doing something complicated and unwelcome. She told herself it was pity. It wasn't. The photograph changed everything. 4 weeks into the arrangement, Celine found it by accident. She was looking for a charging cable in a drawer of the credenza in the living room, a massive, overpriced piece of furniture that served no apparent purpose. And tucked beneath a stack of old financial magazines was a photograph. A woman, young, dark hair, laughing at whoever was holding the camera with the kind of unguarded joy that lights up a face from the inside. On the back, in handwriting that was unmistakably Caspian's, sharp, angular, impatient, were 2 words: Evelyn. Always. Celine stared at it for a long time. Then she put it back exactly where she'd found it and closed the drawer. She didn't ask him about it, not directly, but she started paying attention in a different way, noticing the things she'd been too overwhelmed to see before. The way his voice changed when anyone mentioned the past. The way he avoided an entire wing of the penthouse, the east side, where the afternoon light came in warm and golden. The way he never, ever listened to music, even though the penthouse had a sound system that could have filled Carnegie Hall. 3 days after finding the photograph, she was alone in the penthouse on a rainy afternoon and made the mistake of searching his name paired with Evelyn. The internet gave her the story in fragments, the way the internet always does, pieces of a private tragedy reassembled by strangers into clickbait and gossip. Evelyn Hart, 27 years old, engaged to Caspian Mercer, died of a sudden cardiac event, an undiagnosed heart condition that detonated without warning during a weekend trip to the Hamptons. She collapsed at dinner. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. The articles were 8 years old. The photos showed a different Caspian, younger, softer, with something alive behind his eyes that the current version had burned out of existence. Celine closed her laptop and sat in the silence of the penthouse, listening to the rain, and understood for the first time that the man she had married wasn't cold. He was grieving. He had been grieving for 8 years, and he had dealt with it the only way he knew how, by killing every part of himself that was capable of being hurt again. The realization didn't make her like him more. It made her afraid. Because grief that old, that buried, that meticulously sealed behind walls of money and control, that kind of grief doesn't stay dormant forever. It waits. It builds pressure. And when it finally breaks through, it destroys everything in its path. Celine had signed up for a business arrangement with a cold, calculating billionaire. She was beginning to realize she was trapped in a penthouse with a bomb. The shift happened so gradually that neither of them noticed until it was too late. It started with small things. Caspian came home earlier one Tuesday, 10 p.m. instead of midnight. Celine was in the kitchen making pasta, Something simple and cheap that reminded her of home, and the smell of garlic and butter had drifted through the penthouse like an invasion. He paused in the doorway, looked at her, looked at the pot. "You cook," he said, as if this were new information. "I eat," Celine replied. "Cooking is the thing that happens first." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, but the ghost of one, a muscular memory, something his face used to do before he trained it out. "There's a chef on retainer," he said. "I know, Margaret told me, twice." "And you're making, what is that?" "Aglio e olio. It's pasta with garlic and oil. It costs about $4. He stood there for a moment, and she could feel him calculating, deciding whether engaging in casual conversation fell within the acceptable parameters of their agreement or whether it constituted an unnecessary risk. "Would you like some?" she asked, and the question surprised both of them. He hesitated. Then he sat down at the kitchen island and let her put a bowl of $4 pasta in front of a man who could buy the restaurant it was named after. He ate every bite. After that, something loosened. The silence between them didn't disappear, but it changed texture. Less vacuum, more breathing room. Caspian started coming home earlier. Not every night, but often enough that Celine stopped flinching when she heard the elevator. They talked, cautiously at first, like two people testing the weight of ice they weren't sure would hold. Surface things. The gala schedule. A news article about a building she'd walked past. The weather. Because even billionaires and waitresses from Queens default to weather when they're scared of what comes next. Then one night, 6 weeks in, the surface cracked. They were sitting in the living room after another charity event. Celine in a borrowed gown, Caspian with his tie loosened and a glass of something dark in his hand, and she said something she'd been thinking about for days. "You're different when we're out there." He looked at her. "That's the point." "No, I mean, you're good at it. The performance. You're actually convincing. Years of practice." "Is that what it is? Practice?" He set his glass down. "What are you asking?" Celine pulled her feet up onto the couch, and the gesture was so normal, so distinctly her, that it disrupted the curated atmosphere of the room like a splash of color on a gray wall. "I'm asking if any of it is real. The way you act at those events, the charm, the attention, the way you look at me like—" She stopped. "Never mind." "Like what?" "Like I matter." The words hung between them. Caspian didn't answer immediately, and the delay told her more than any words could have. A rehearsed man would have responded instantly. A controlled man would have deflected. But Caspian sat with the question, and the sitting was its own kind of honesty. "I don't know," he finally said, and the admission cost him something. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped, the way his grip tightened on the armrest. "I haven't known the difference between performance and reality in a long time." Celine looked at him across the dim living room, the city glowing behind him through the glass, and felt something dangerous settle into her chest. Compassion, understanding, the terrible, inconvenient recognition that the person sitting across from her was not a villain. He was a ruin, and ruins, unlike villains, make you want to rebuild them. She stood up. "Good night, Caspian." "Good night." She was halfway up the stairs when his voice reached her again, quiet enough that she could have pretended not to hear it. "Celine." She stopped. "For what it's worth, wait. When I look at you at those events, it's not entirely performance." She didn't turn around. She climbed the stairs, went to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, breathing the way she always breathed when the world shifted under her feet. In, out, in, out. After that night, the walls between them didn't fall. They thinned. And thin walls are worse than thick ones because you can hear everything through them. Every breath, every restless movement, every unspoken thing pressing against the other side. Caspian started remembering details about her. Not the details from her file, her address, her education, her employment history, but the real ones. The ones that only come from paying attention. He noticed she hummed while she cooked. Always the same melody. Something she'd heard her mother sing when she was little, though she couldn't remember the name. He noticed she reread books when she was anxious. The same 3 novels cycled in rotation, their spines cracked and soft from years of handling. He noticed her favorite flowers were peonies, not because she told him, but because she stopped every single time they passed a vendor selling them on the street, and her whole body changed. Shoulders dropping, breath slowing, a brief flash of something uncomplicated crossing her face. One morning, she came downstairs to find a vase of peonies on the kitchen counter. Fresh, pink and white. No note. Margaret would have said they were part of the household floral arrangement, but Margaret ordered orchids. Always orchids. Clean, architectural, predictable. Peonies were messy, soft, overgrown with beauty, spilling open like they couldn't contain themselves. Peonies were a choice. Celine stared at them for a long time, standing alone in the quiet kitchen, and felt the contract between them stretch and strain like fabric pulled too tight. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. And then the phone call came, and everything that had been building between them, the tentative conversations, the accidental tenderness, the fragile architecture of two people learning to exist in the same space, collided head-on with a force neither of them had prepared for. Roman Mercer, Caspian's father. Celine was in the living room when Caspian took the call in his study. The door was closed, but the penthouse was built for aesthetics, not soundproofing, and his voice carried, or rather, his silence carried, punctuated by short, clipped responses that sounded less like a conversation and more like a man absorbing blows. I understand. A pause. That won't be necessary. A longer pause. I said I understand, Father. When he emerged 20 minutes later, the man who had been softening, the man who ate $4 pasta and bought peonies and admitted he didn't know the difference between performance and reality, was gone. In his place stood the original Caspian, cold, remote, sealed shut like a vault. What happened? Celine asked. Nothing that concerns you. The words landed like a slap, and she felt the distance between them snap back into place so fast it left a mark. Caspian. The arrangement is proceeding as planned. That's all that matters. He didn't look at her. He walked to the bar cart, poured whiskey into a glass that was not the one he'd broken weeks ago, and drank it standing in front of the window like a man staring down a firing squad. Celine stood behind him, 5 feet and 1,000 miles away, and realized something that turned her blood cold. Whoever Roman Mercer was, whatever he'd said on that phone call, it had undone every inch of progress Caspian had made toward being human again. And if his father could do that with a single phone call, what else was he capable of? She would find out soon enough. Because 3 days later, a black town car began appearing outside her mother's apartment building in Astoria. It would sit there for hours, engine idling, windows tinted. Her mother noticed it first, then her neighbors. Then Celine got a text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. Enjoy the arrangement, dear. Celine stared at the screen, her pulse climbing, her hands going cold. And for the first time since she signed that contract in the law office 47 stories above Manhattan, she understood that she hadn't just married a man. She had walked into a war. And the enemy wasn't Caspian. It was the man who made him. The black town car didn't come back the next day. It didn't need to. The message had already done its work. It lived inside Celine's chest now, 4 words pulsing like a second heartbeat. Enjoy the arrangement, dear. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw the tinted windows sitting outside her mother's building like a held breath. She didn't tell Caspian, not immediately. Some part of her, the part raised in Queens, the part that learned early to solve her own problems because nobody else was going to, wanted to handle it herself. Figure out who sent the text. Figure out what it meant. Figure out whether the threat was real or just theater designed to rattle her. But another part of her, the part that had watched Caspian's entire body language change after a single phone call from his father, already knew the answer. She told him on a Wednesday night. He was in the kitchen, a rare occurrence, standing at the counter with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, pouring coffee at 9 p.m. like a man who had given up on the concept of sleep. Celine walked in, set her phone on the counter between them, and slid it toward him with the text message open. Caspian looked at the screen. His face didn't change. Nothing about him moved. Not his hands, not his jaw, not the careful blankness he wore like a second skin. But something behind his eyes went dark, the way a room goes dark when someone kills the power at the breaker. When did this come? He asked. 3 days ago. His gaze snapped to her. 3 days. I wasn't sure if 3 days, Celine, you sat on this for 3 days. I didn't know what it meant. You knew exactly what it meant. The anger in his voice surprised her. Not because it was loud, shtim. It wasn't. Caspian didn't do loud. He did quiet and surgical, and right now his words carried the precision of a man who was controlling his fury the way you control a fire. Carefully, deliberately, knowing one wrong breath could burn the whole building down. "Is this him?" she asked. "Your father?" Caspian picked up the phone, studied the number, and something passed across his face that was less than rage and more than resignation. It was recognition, the tired, toxic familiarity of someone who had been dealing with this kind of thing their entire life. "The number will trace to a prepaid device," he said. "It always does. Always. This has happened before." He set the phone down. "My father doesn't threaten people directly. He creates atmospheres, presence without fingerprints, intimidation without evidence." He paused. "The car outside your mother's building, did you get a plate number?" "My mother was too scared to look." "I'll have someone handle it." "Handle it how?" "Security, surveillance, countermeasures." Celine stared at him. "Countermeasures. We're talking about my mother's apartment, not a military operation. When it comes to my father, there's no difference." He said it flatly, without drama. The way someone describes weather or traffic, just the facts of the world he lived in. And that flatness scared Celine more than anything else. Because it meant this wasn't new. It meant this was normal. It meant the man she had married existed inside a reality where private investigators and intimidation tactics and untraceable phone numbers were just the background noise of being a mercer. "Tell me about him," she said. "Your father? Not the business stuff? Not the public version? Tell me who he actually is." Caspian's hands were on the counter, fingers spread, palms flat. He stared at them like he was reading something written on his own skin. "Roman Mercer built his company on one principle," he said slowly. "That sentiment is weakness. Emotion is liability. Attachment is the fastest way to lose everything you've built." He lifted his eyes to hers. "He raised me the same way he built the company." "Meaning what?" "Meaning every time I showed affection for something, a friend, a hobby, a dog I found when I was 9, he removed it, systematically, to teach me that caring about anything outside of the business was a vulnerability that would be exploited." The kitchen was quiet. The coffee maker hissed softly on the counter behind him. "The dog," Celine said. "What happened to the dog?" "Celine, what happened to it?" He held her gaze for 3 seconds, 4, 5, then he looked away. "He gave it away while I was at school. When I came home, it was gone. He told me the animal was a distraction, and that distractions cost money. I was 9 years old, and I sat at the dinner table that night and ate everything on my plate without saying a word, because I had already learned that if I cried, the punishment would be worse." Celine felt something hot and terrible rise in her throat. Not pity, something harder, something with teeth. "And Evelyn?" she said quietly. The name landed like a grenade. Caspian's entire body went rigid. Every muscle, every tendon, every micro-expression he'd been managing with exhausting precision. All of it locked at once, and for a moment he looked like a man who'd been flash-frozen mid-breath. "How do you know that name?" "I found a photograph. In the credenza. I wasn't looking for it." "You searched the apartment." "I was looking for a phone charger, Caspian. The picture was in a drawer." He pushed off the counter, turned away. She watched his back, the tension running through his shoulders like steel cable, the way his head dropped forward, the barely visible expansion and contraction of his ribs as he forced himself to breathe. "Evelyn has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this. She's the reason you are the way you are. She's the reason this apartment feels like a mausoleum. She's the reason you can't stop. Can't let anyone close enough to I said stop." He turned around, and his face was wrecked, not angry. Wrecked. The mask wasn't gone. It was cracked, fractured along fault lines that had been deepening for 8 years. And through the cracks she could see the original wound, still raw, still bleeding, still exactly as fresh as the day it was made. "She died, he said. "She died sitting across from me at a restaurant in Montauk. One second she was laughing, and the next second she was on the floor, and I held her while we waited for the paramedics, and her heart stopped in my arms. She was 27. We were supposed to get married in October." Bo Walspastworms. His voice was steady, mechanical, reciting facts the way he recited contract terms, because facts were manageable. Facts didn't require feeling. Facts could be delivered without falling apart. My father attended the funeral and told me afterward that it was for the best, that she had been making me soft, that her death, while unfortunate, was an opportunity to refocus. Celine's hand was over her mouth. She could feel her own breath hot against her palm. An opportunity, she whispered. Those were his exact words. An opportunity to refocus. The kitchen felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. The city lights beyond the window seemed dimmer, farther away, like Manhattan itself was pulling back from the ugliness of what was being said inside these walls. So you understand, Caspian continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a murmur, when I tell you that my father is not someone who makes idle threats. He is someone who identifies what you love and uses it as leverage. That is his only skill, and he has spent 63 years perfecting it. Celine lowered her hand from her mouth. And what does he want from you now? Control. He wants control of the merger, control of the board, control of me. He's been losing his grip for the past 2 years, and the Ashford acquisition is the last piece of real power he has left. If the deal goes through under my leadership, not his mine, he becomes irrelevant. And Roman Mercer would rather destroy everything than become irrelevant. So the marriage, our marriage, it's not just about optics for the board. It was, in the beginning. And now? He looked at her, and the exhaustion in his face was so complete, so total, that it aged him 10 years in the space of a breath. Now my father knows you exist, which means you're a variable. And Roman Mercer does not tolerate variables he can't control. Celine sat down on one of the kitchen stools. Her legs had been steady all night, but they weren't steady anymore. So what do we do? She asked. We do nothing different. We maintain the arrangement. We attend the events. We give him nothing to use. And my family? I'll put security on your mother's building. Your brother's medical team will be notified to restrict visitor access. No one gets near Liam without clearance. Clearance, Celine repeated. My 17-year-old brother is going to need security clearance for his hospital visitors. Yes, she laughed. It came out broken, jagged, the kind of laugh that sits right next to crying and sounds almost identical. This is insane, she said. Yes. I signed up to pretend to be your wife for a year. I didn't sign up for this. I know. So what happens when... Celine. He stepped closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, could see the vein pulsing at his temple. I will not let him hurt your family. Whatever else this arrangement is or isn't, that is something I can promise you. She looked up at him, searched his face, looked for the lie, the calculation, the angle. Because there was always an angle with Caspian Mercer, always a cost-benefit analysis running behind those cold, intelligent eyes. She didn't find one. What she found instead was worse. Sincerity. Raw. Uncomfortable. Obviously unfamiliar sincerity. The kind that sat on him like ill-fitting clothes. The kind that made him look vulnerable in a way that all the money and power and controlled silence in the world couldn't protect against. Okay, she said. He nodded once, turned back to the counter, picked up his coffee. And just like that, the walls went back up. Not as high as before, not as thick, but up. And they returned to their separate corners of the penthouse like boxers retreating to opposite sides of the ring, breathing hard, waiting for the next round. The next round came faster than either of them expected. Roman Mercer didn't send another text. He didn't need to. What he did was worse because it was legal, public, and impossible to fight. Celine found out on a Friday morning when her phone rang at 7 a.m., and her mother's voice came through the speaker shredded with panic. They're auditing us, Celine. The IRS. They called this morning. They said there are irregularities in your father's taxes from 4 years ago. 4 years. And they want to review everything. Every receipt, every bank statement, every... Mom, slow down. Your father is a retired electrician, Celine. He doesn't have irregularities. He barely has income. This is... I know what this is. Do you? Because I don't. I don't understand any of this. 3 weeks ago, there was a car outside our building, and now the IRS is calling at 7 in the morning, and your brother... Her mother's voice cracked. Liam called last night. He said someone came to the hospital, someone in a suit, asking questions about his treatment, about who was paying, about... Someone went to the hospital? He said the man had a card. He said he was from some kind of oversight committee. Liam didn't know what to do, so he answered the questions, and now he's upset, and the doctors are saying his stress levels are affecting his... Selena was already moving, already grabbing her coat, already shoving her feet into shoes, already calculating the fastest way to get from the Upper East Side to Mount Sinai, while her mother's voice dissolved into the kind of crying that comes from a woman who has spent the last year watching her son fight for his life and has reached the absolute limit of what a human being can endure. Mom, listen to me. Don't answer any more calls. Don't open the door for anyone you don't recognize. I'm going to fix this. How? Celine, how are you going to fix this? You're married to... I said I'm going to fix it. She hung up, stood in the hallway of the penthouse, her reflection staring back at her from the polished marble floor, wild-haired, pale, wearing a coat thrown over pajamas, looking exactly like a woman whose carefully constructed house of cards was being blown apart by someone who didn't even need to be in the room to do it. Caspian was gone. Of course he was. 6:45 a.m., already at the office, already behind the desk where he spent most of his life avoiding the mess that lived inside his chest. She called him. Straight to voicemail. She texted. No response. She grabbed her bag and took the elevator down 47 floors, walked through the marble lobby past the doorman who called her Mrs. Mercer, and stepped into the cold morning air of Manhattan with her teeth clenched and her hands shaking and a fury building inside her that had nothing to do with Caspian and everything to do with the man who had spent 63 years turning cruelty into an art form. She found Caspian at the Mercer financial offices in Midtown, behind a glass wall in a corner office on the 32nd floor. His assistant tried to stop her. A security guard stepped forward. Celine walked past both of them like they were furniture and pushed through the office door hard enough that it bounced against the wall. Caspian was on the phone. He looked up, took in her face, the pajamas under the coat, the unwashed hair, the expression that was somewhere between terrified and murderous, and ended his call mid-sentence. What happened? He said. Celine told him. All of it. The IRS audit. The man at the hospital. Liam's stress levels spiking. Her mother crying on the phone at 7 in the morning. She told him standing in the middle of his office with her arms crossed over her chest and her voice shaking. And when she was done, the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Caspian stood up, slowly. He walked around his desk, past her without a word, and closed the office door. Then he pulled the blinds on the glass wall, shutting out the curious faces of his staff who had watched the entire entrance like it was a scene from a movie. When he turned back to her, his face was different. Not cold, not controlled, something else. Something she hadn't seen before. Focused. The way a predator focuses. The man at the hospital, he said. Describe him. Liam said he was in his 50s. Gray suit, thin, had a business card from something called the Mercer Foundation Oversight Committee. There is no Mercer Foundation Oversight Committee. I figured. My father created a fake entity to access your brother's medical records. Can he do that? He just did. Caspian moved to his desk, picked up a phone, not his cell, a landline, and dialed a number from memory. The conversation that followed was short, surgical, and delivered in a tone that Celine had never heard him use before. Not angry, not emotional, cold. Coldness that had been weaponized, honed, sharpened into something that could cut through steel. He gave instructions, names, account numbers, authorization codes. He referenced legal statutes by number and threatened consequences with the casual specificity of a man who had been preparing for this particular war his entire life. When he hung up, he looked at her. Your brother's hospital access has been locked down. New clearance protocol, effective immediately. Only names on the approved list get through the door. The IRS audit on your parents will be challenged through our legal team, Caldwell and Associates. They specialize in politically motivated tax actions. Your mother and father will not need to do anything. Caspian. I'm not finished. I'm also placing a formal cease and desist on my father's personal office, which will accomplish nothing legally, but will let him know that I know exactly what he's doing and that I am choosing to fight back. He expected me to absorb this quietly. He miscalculated. Celine stared at him. Her hands had stopped shaking. But something new had replaced the trembling, a warmth that spread through her chest like slow flame. And she hated it, hated the gratitude because gratitude was proximity, and proximity was danger, and she could not afford to feel anything real for this man. Not now. Not with everything that was happening. Why? She asked. Why what? Why are you doing this? This level of intervention, the lawyers, the security, the hospital protocols, this goes beyond our contract. This isn't part of the arrangement. He looked at her for a long time. The office was quiet. 32 floors below, Manhattan hummed with its usual indifferent urgency, and up here in this glass box suspended above the city, two people stood on opposite sides of a line that was becoming harder to see. No, he said, it isn't. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Celine felt the line between them blur another inch, and she didn't step back. That was her mistake. Or maybe it was his. Maybe it was both. The weeks that followed were a strange, exhausting dual existence. On one front, they fought Roman Mercer's shadow war. Lawyers countering legal threats, security details monitoring Celine's family, an information campaign carefully designed to expose the old man's attempts to destabilize the merger without triggering the public scandal that would destroy them all. On the other front, something quieter and far more dangerous was happening inside the penthouse. Caspian stopped pretending. Not all at once, not dramatically. But the small performances, the calculated distance, the rehearsed indifference, the careful maintenance of boundaries that had kept their arrangement safely transactional, those fell away one by one, like leaves from a tree that had decided winter was over. He started waiting for her. Not obviously. Not sitting in the living room watching the elevator like a dog. But she noticed that when she came home late from visiting Liam at the hospital, there was always a light on in the kitchen, always fresh water in the kettle, always some small, silent evidence that he had been aware of her absence and had prepared for her return. She noticed that when they attended events together, his hand on her waist wasn't performance anymore. It was reflex. The way he leaned in to hear her speak, tilting his head with an attention that seemed to cost him nothing, that wasn't rehearsed. That was a man who had discovered to his own apparent horror that he genuinely wanted to hear what she had to say, and the conversations. The midnight conversations that had started as cautious surface-level exchanges had become something else entirely. They sat on the living room floor one night, the floor, not the $10,000 couch, because Celine had slid down there first, and Caspian had followed without comment, and talked until 3 in the morning about things that had nothing to do with the merger, the contract, or the war with Roman. She told him about growing up in Queens, about her father, a union electrician who could fix anything in a building but couldn't fix the furnace in his own apartment, about her mother, who worked at a dry cleaner 6 days a week and still managed to make Sunday dinners feel like a holiday, about Liam, who had been the funny one, the bright one, the kid who could make an entire room laugh before the cancer taught him that some jokes stop being funny when the audience knows the punchline. Caspian listened with the focus of someone who had never been told these kinds of stories. Not because he didn't know people had families and childhoods and kitchen table memories, but because nobody had ever offered to share theirs with him. His childhood had been boardrooms and tutors and silence. His father's idea of quality time was reviewing quarterly earnings at the dinner table. His mother, a subject he almost never mentioned, had left when he was 12, choosing self-preservation over the slow suffocation of being married to a man who viewed love as an accounting error. She sends a card at Christmas, he said that night, sitting on the floor with his back against the couch, and his eyes fixed on some middle distance only he could see. Every year, same card, generic. She signs it, Best, Catherine. Not Mom, not Mother. Best. Celine didn't say anything. She sat beside him, her shoulder almost touching his, and let the silence hold the weight of what he'd just shared. Because some things don't need a response. Some things just need a witness. That was the night Caspian reached over, without looking at her, and took her hand. Not dramatically, not romantically, just a slow, tentative reach across the cold hardwood floor, his fingers finding hers, wrapping around them, holding on the way a drowning man holds on to the edge of a boat. Celine held his hand back. They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing, and the penthouse didn't feel like a mausoleum anymore. It felt like a place where two broken people were building something fragile and foolish and entirely unauthorized by the contract they had signed in that law office 8 weeks ago. It felt, against all logic and self-preservation, like the beginning of something real. The gala at the Metropolitan was supposed to be routine. Another performance. Another night of curated smiles and choreographed intimacy for an audience of shareholders and socialites. Margaret had briefed Celine on the guest list, the seating chart, the 4 people she absolutely had to speak to, and the 2 she absolutely had to avoid. Celine wore black. Caspian wore charcoal. They arrived together in the back of a town car, and when he helped her out, his hand lingered on hers for a beat longer than necessary, and neither of them acknowledged it. The evening proceeded as expected until it didn't. Roman Mercer was there. Celine saw him before Caspian did. He was standing near the east wall of the gallery, holding a champagne flute he hadn't touched, surrounded by a small cluster of men who all shared the same predatory posture, shoulders back, chins up, smiles that showed teeth. Roman was tall. Taller than Caspian, though thinner, with the gaunt, sharp-boned elegance of a man who had spent his life consuming others instead of food. His hair was white, swept back from a forehead lined with the topography of 6 decades of strategic malice. His eyes were the same color as Caspian's, pale, almost colorless. But where Caspian's held emptiness, Roman's held something worse. Amusement. He looked like a man who was enjoying himself. Caspian. She touched his arm. Your father. Caspian's entire bearing changed. She felt it happen, the stiffening, the subtle shift in his center of gravity, the way his breath shortened to shallow, controlled pulls. He didn't look at Roman, not directly, but his awareness of the man was total, the way prey is aware of a predator in the room even before seeing it. I know, he said. Did you know he'd be here? No. What do we? Nothing. We do nothing. We don't approach. We don't engage. He's here to provoke a reaction, and we are not going to give him one. They lasted 20 minutes. Roman approached them near the bar, moving through the crowd with the unhurried precision of someone who knows the room belongs to him, regardless of whose name is on the invitation. Caspian. His voice was warm. That was the worst part. Warm and measured and paternal, the voice of a man who could tell you he was dismantling your life and make it sound like fatherly concern. And Celine, what a pleasure. Up close, Roman Mercer smelled like expensive leather and something antiseptic, something chemical beneath the cologne, as if the man underneath the grooming had been preserved rather than aged. Father, Caspian said. The word came out clipped, bitten off at the edges. You look well, both of you. Roman's eyes moved to Celine Chomti, and his gaze traveled over her with the slow, appraising attention of a man evaluating livestock. Marriage agrees with you, my dear. You have a certain glow. Thank you, Celine said, and the 2 words tasted like poison in her mouth. I understand your brother is making progress. The Novacure trial. Remarkable program. Expensive, of course. These experimental treatments always are. He smiled. But then, that's what family is for, isn't it? Taking care of one another. The threat wasn't even subtle. It sat there between them, polished and gleaming, a razor blade on a silver platter. Caspian stepped forward. Not much. Half a step. But the motion carried weight, the compressed, coiled energy of a man holding himself back from something violent. We're leaving, Caspian said. So soon. The evening's barely begun. Celine, Caspian's hand found the small of her back, firm, guiding. Let's go. They were almost clear of the gallery when Roman's voice found them one last time, pitched just loud enough to carry over the ambient murmur of wealth and crystal. Give my regards to your mother-in-law, Caspian. Lovely woman. I understand she's been under a great deal of stress. Celine felt Caspian's hand spasm against her back. A single, involuntary contraction, fingers pressing hard enough to leave an impression through the fabric of her dress. Then they were moving, through the gallery, through the lobby, out the glass doors and into the cold night air, where the town car was already waiting because Margaret ran that kind of operation. Inside the car, Caspian sat rigid against the leather seat, his hands on his knees, his jaw clenched so hard Celine could see the muscles working beneath his skin. He's going to keep escalating, she said. Yes. He mentioned my mother, by implication. He mentioned Liam's treatment. I know what he mentioned. So what's the plan? Because security details and cease and desist letters clearly aren't. The plan is the merger. His voice was flat, mechanical. The voice of a man retreating into strategy because emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Once the Ashford deal closes, my father loses his last leverage point on the board. Without board influence, he can't touch the company, the funding, or the treatment. The deal closes in 9 weeks. We hold the line for 9 weeks. And if he does something worse before then? Caspian turned his head and looked at her in the dark interior of the car. City lights passed over his face in rhythmic pulses. Bright, dark, bright, dark. And in the fragmented illumination, she saw something that scared her more than Roman's threats. Doubt. Caspian Mercer, who planned everything, controlled everything, calculated every outcome 3 moves ahead, he looked at her with doubt. "Then I will deal with it," he said, "whatever it takes." The words were right. The conviction behind them was real, but the doubt stayed in his eyes like a stain that wouldn't wash out. And Celine sat beside him in the dark car as it carried them back through Manhattan and wondered for the first time whether the two of them were enough to survive what was coming. She found the document 11 days later. It was an accident. Everything that mattered in this story was an accident. The photograph, the broken glass, the hand-holding on the living room floor, and now this. Celine had never been someone who went looking for trouble. Trouble just kept falling into her lap like a cat that couldn't take a hint. Caspian was in London. A 3-day trip for the Ashford negotiation. The final round of meetings before the deal reached the board for a vote. He'd left at 4 in the morning, and Celine had been half awake when he paused in her doorway. Her doorway, not his, which meant he had walked down a flight of stairs to stand there in the dark, watching her sleep, before catching himself and leaving. She knew because she heard his footsteps. She'd been tracking his footsteps for weeks now, an involuntary habit, the way you track the movements of someone who has become important to you before you've given yourself permission to admit it. He was gone. The penthouse was empty, and Celine, unable to sleep, wandered into his study to find a book she'd seen on his shelf. A worn copy of something she'd mentioned loving, which had appeared there 3 days after she mentioned it. Another small, silent signal in his growing catalog of unspoken affection. The safe was open. Not wide open. Cracked. The door ajar by 2 inches as though he'd been in it before leaving and hadn't pushed it fully closed in his 4 a.m. fog. The digital lock blinked green. The interior was dark. She should have closed it, should have pushed the door shut, found her book, and gone back to bed. Should have respected the boundary, honored the contract, maintained the careful architecture of a relationship that was supposed to be nothing more than a business arrangement. She opened it. Inside, a stack of folders, financial documents, legal correspondence, and at the bottom, a manila envelope with a red tab marked Confidential, Amendment 4. She pulled it out, opened it, read it, and the floor fell out from under her feet. It was a contract amendment, a revision to their original marriage agreement, drafted by Caspian's legal team, bearing his signature and a date that made her vision blur. The amendment changed the terms. Drastically. Under the original contract, Celine could walk away after 12 months with no financial penalty. Clean break. Done. Under the amendment, the marriage became indefinite. Dissolution would trigger a penalty clause so catastrophic, tied to Liam's medical funding, her parents' financial security, every piece of leverage that Roman had already demonstrated a willingness to exploit, that leaving would be functionally impossible. The amendment was a trap, and the date on it, the date Caspian had signed it, the date his lawyers had drafted it, was 6 weeks ago. Before the pasta in the kitchen, before the peonies, before the midnight confessions on the living room floor. Before he took her hand and held it like she was the only solid thing in a world made of water. Before any of it. He had signed this document and then spent 6 weeks making her fall for him. Celine stood in the study, holding the papers with hands that had gone completely numb, and felt something inside her chest collapse. Not break, collapse. The way buildings collapse. The way structures that looked solid from the outside turn out to be hollow and come down all at once in a cascade of dust and silence. She read it again, word by word, clause by clause, looking for a misunderstanding, an alternate interpretation, anything that would make the date mean something other than what it meant. There was nothing. The document was clear. The date was clear. The signature was clear. Caspian Mercer had looked at her across a kitchen counter, eaten her $4 pasta, bought her flowers, held her hand in the dark, and all of it, every gesture, every moment of manufactured vulnerability, had happened after he had already signed a document designed to make sure she could never leave. Celine set the papers down on his desk. She walked to the kitchen. She poured a glass of water, drank it, and set the glass in the sink with the careful, deliberate movements of someone holding themselves together through pure mechanical effort. Then she went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the wall until the sun came up. She didn't cry. She was done crying. Caspian came home from London on a Thursday evening, and Celine was waiting for him in the kitchen. Not sitting, standing, arms crossed. The amendment laid flat on the counter between them like a body at a crime scene. He saw it the moment he walked in. His garment bag slipped off his shoulder. His face, tired from the flight, from 3 days of negotiation, from whatever private war was always running behind his eyes, went completely blank. Not cold blank. Not the controlled blankness of the mask he wore for the world. Empty blank. The blankness of a man who has just realized that the worst thing he ever did has been found, and there is nowhere left to hide. Explain this, Celine said. Celine, explain this. He set his bag down, walked to the counter, looked at the document. His hand came up, fingers touching the edge of the paper, and Celine watched his throat move as he swallowed. A hard, visible swallow, the kind that happens when the body is processing something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. I drafted it 6 weeks ago, he said. I can see the date. Before you what? Before you started pretending to be human? Before you held my hand on the floor and made me think you were actually capable of feeling something? I wasn't pretending. The hell you weren't. Her voice was rising now, and she let it, because the alternative was screaming, and the alternative after that was breaking things, and the alternative after that was walking out the door and never coming back. And she wasn't ready for that yet, because she needed him to look her in the eye and explain how a man could sign a document that would trap a woman, and then spend 6 weeks convincing her the cage was home. I was afraid, he said. Afraid. I felt it happening. What was developing between us? And I panicked, because the last time I let someone in, the last time I let myself feel something that wasn't controlled and calculated and safe, she died in my arms, and my father told me it was an opportunity. His voice cracked on the last word. Actually cracked, like a physical thing breaking, like bone or glass or the carefully maintained surface of a man who had spent 8 years making sure nothing could touch him ever again. So I went to my lawyers and I drafted something that would guarantee you couldn't leave. Not because I wanted to control you, because I was terrified, genuinely, pathetically terrified of what would happen to me if you did. Celine stared at him. Rain had started outside. Of course it had, because this city seemed to save its worst weather for her worst moments, and the sound of it against the windows was relentless, brutal, the kind of rain that doesn't comfort but accuses. You had no right, she said, no right to make that decision for me. I know. You sat across from me and you ate my food and you held my hand and you knew the whole time that you had already locked the door. I know. Stop saying I know. Her voice broke now, and she hated it, hated the crack because it gave him something he didn't deserve. Evidence that she cared enough to be hurt. Tell me something useful. Tell me something that isn't just you standing there agreeing with me while the damage is already done. Caspian's hands were at his sides, open, not fists, not defensive, just hanging there empty, like a man who has dropped everything he was carrying and doesn't know how to pick it back up. I can destroy the amendment, he said, right now, in front of you. It was never filed, never executed. It exists only as a draft, and I can tear it apart, and it will have no legal standing. That doesn't fix what it means. No, it doesn't. It means you don't know how to love someone without controlling them. It means every moment of honesty between us might have been strategy. It means I have no way of knowing whether the man standing in front of me right now is real or just another version of the performance. He closed his eyes. She watched his face contort, watched the muscles around his jaw and his brow fight each other, watched the last fragile architecture of his composure buckle and give way. I don't know either, he said, and his voice was raw, stripped, the voice of someone speaking from a place that hadn't seen light in years. I have spent so long performing that I don't know where the performance ends and I begin. You asked me that once, whether any of it was real, and I told you I didn't know. I still don't. But I know that when I'm with you, the distance between what's real and what's performed is smaller than it's ever been. And that terrifies me more than anything my father has ever done. Celine gripped the edge of the counter. Her knuckles were white. Her breath was coming in short, ragged pulls that she couldn't control, and the rain outside was hammering the glass like something trying to get in. She opened her mouth to respond, to say what, she didn't know, forgiveness or fury or something in between, when her phone buzzed on the counter. She looked down. A text from her mother. 2 words. Liam collapsed. Celine grabbed her phone, grabbed her coat, and was out the door before Caspian could say another word. The elevator closed on his face, gray, devastated, standing alone in the kitchen next to a document that proved he was exactly the kind of man she'd always been afraid he was. And as the elevator dropped 47 floors toward the lobby, Celine pressed her back against the cold metal wall and felt the full weight of everything she'd been carrying finally settle onto her chest like a stone. Her brother was in the hospital. Her marriage was a lie built on top of another lie. And the man she had been falling for, the man she had been stupid enough, reckless enough, lonely enough to let past every defense she had, was either the most broken person she had ever met or the most dangerous. She didn't know which. She wasn't sure he knew either. And somewhere in Manhattan, Roman Mercer was watching all of it burn and smiling. The hospital smelled like bleach and bad news. Celine came through the emergency entrance at Mount Sinai with her coat half buttoned and her hair still wet from the rain, and the fluorescent lights hit her like an interrogation. Everything was too bright, too sharp, too real. The squeak of rubber shoes on linoleum, the mechanical beeping from rooms she couldn't see. The particular quality of silence that hospitals generate, the kind that sounds like waiting. She found her mother in the hallway outside the ICU. Patricia Vale was sitting in a plastic chair that looked like it had been designed to make comfort impossible. Her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She was 54 years old but looked 70. The last year had eaten her alive. The diagnosis, the treatments, the bills, the slow erosion of hope, followed by the desperate resurrection of it. When Celine had come home one night and told her parents that the money was handled, the treatment was secured, everything was going to be okay. She hadn't told them how, not the real how. She'd said Caspian was a friend, a benefactor, someone she'd met through work who believed in helping people. The lie had been easy at the time. Now it sat in her chest like shrapnel. "Mom." Patricia looked up. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed, the eyes of someone who had been crying for hours and had reached the stage where tears stop being emotional and become purely physical, the body producing them out of exhaustion rather than grief. "They stabilized him," Patricia said, "about an hour ago. His blood pressure dropped. They said it was stress-induced. Something about cortisol levels and how his immune system is already compromised and the stress is—" She stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "He was scared, Celine. He was lying in that bed asking for you, and he was scared." Celine knelt in front of her mother and took the coffee cup out of her hands, set it on the floor, took her mother's fingers, which were cold and dry and trembling, and held them. "Can I see him?" "They said family only, 30 minutes. Celine stood, walked to the ICU desk, gave her name, was led through a set of double doors into a ward that smelled like antiseptic and defeat. Liam was in the 3rd bed on the left. He was thin, thinner than the last time she'd seen him, which had been 12 days ago, and 12 days should not produce this kind of change in a human body. His skin had the translucent quality of paper held up to light. You could see the veins in his temples, the blue-green map of his circulatory system working visibly beneath a surface that seemed barely capable of containing it. His head was shaved, not by choice, but by chemistry. And the absence of his dark curly hair, the hair that had been his vanity, his trademark, the thing he'd spent 20 minutes styling every morning before the diagnosis, made him look alien, foreign, like a sketch of the brother she remembered, rendered by someone who'd only heard him described. He was awake. "Hey," he said. "Hey, you look terrible. You're one to talk." He smiled. It was a ghost of the smile she remembered. The one that could light up a room, that could make teachers forgive late homework and nurses bring extra pudding. But the architecture was still there. The same crooked lift at the left corner, the same spark of defiance that said, "I'm still here, I'm still me, you don't get to feel sorry for me yet." Celine sat on the edge of his bed. The mattress was thin. The sheets were rough. Everything in this room was designed for function, not comfort. And the machine beside his bed beeped with a steady, indifferent rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down. "What happened?" she asked. "I got stressed." "About what?" Liam's eyes shifted. Not evasion exactly, more like the instinct of a 17-year-old who doesn't want to add to his sister's burden but doesn't know how to lie to her face. "The guy came back," he said. Celine's entire body went still. "What guy?" "The one from before. The one with the card. From the oversight committee or whatever." "Liam, that man has no authority to be here. Caspian put security protocols in place. He didn't come inside. He was in the parking lot. I saw him from the window." Liam's voice was quiet, measured, the voice of a kid who had learned to deliver bad news calmly because he'd been delivering bad news about his own body for the past 14 months. "He was just standing there, looking up at the building. He stood there for like an hour." "Did you tell anyone?" "I told the nurse. She said she'd report it, but I couldn't stop looking at him, and then I started thinking about what he asked me last time, about who was paying, about whether the treatment would continue if something changed, and my chest got tight, and I couldn't breathe right, and then everything went sideways." His hand was on the blanket beside him, small, bony. The wristband with his name and patient number looked like it could slide right off. Celine took his hand, held it the way she used to hold it when he was 6 and scared of thunderstorms. Firm, steady, both palms wrapped around his fingers, forming a seal against the world. "Nothing is going to change," she said. "Your treatment is secure. Nobody is going to take it away." "Promise?" "Promise." The word left her mouth and immediately turned to ash, because she didn't know if it was true. 12 hours ago, she had been standing in Caspian's kitchen discovering that the man funding her brother's treatment had drafted a legal document designed to trap her. She had no idea what was real anymore: the funding, the protection, the promises. All of it rested on the word of a man who had proven, in writing, that his instinct when faced with genuine human emotion was to reach for a contract in a cage. But Liam was looking at her with eyes that were too old for his face and too young for what they'd seen, and she would have promised him the moon was made of copper and the ocean was sweet water if it meant he could close his eyes and sleep without fear. "Promise," she said again, and the lie tasted like medicine, bitter, necessary, impossible to spit out. She stayed until visiting hours ended, kissed Liam's forehead, told him she loved him, walked out through the double doors and found her mother asleep in the plastic chair, head tipped back, mouth slightly open, the styrofoam cup on the floor beside her where Celine had left it. She covered her mother with her own coat, sat down in the adjacent chair. And for 15 minutes, she stared at the wall across from her and let herself feel the full, crushing weight of everything. Her phone buzzed. Caspian. "Is he okay?" She typed back with numb fingers. "Stabilized. Don't come here." A pause. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "I'm sorry." She locked the phone and put it face down in her lap. "Sorry." He was sorry. The man who had spent 8 years building a fortress out of grief and control and emotional bankruptcy was sorry. The man whose father had sent someone to stand in a parking lot and stare at a hospital window until a 17-year-old cancer patient had a stress-induced collapse. That man was sorry. Celine closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wall and tried to figure out what sorry was worth in a currency she could actually spend. She came up empty. She went home at 6 in the morning. Home. The word was wrong, but she used it anyway, because after 2 months, the penthouse had stopped being a stranger's apartment and started being the place where she slept and ate and had her heart methodically dismantled by a man who didn't know how to love without breaking things. Caspian was waiting. He was sitting on the stairs, not in the living room, not at the kitchen island, not in any of the curated spaces designed for human occupation. On the stairs. Like a man who had been pacing and had simply run out of momentum at that particular step. He looked wrecked. His shirt was untucked, wrinkled. His hair, which was always precise, was pushed in different directions like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. His shoes were off. His feet were bare on the marble step, and there was something so vulnerable about that detail. The bare feet, the exposed toes, the absence of armor all the way down to the ground, that Celine had to stop in the hallway and collect herself before she could speak. "He's okay," she said. "For now." Caspian nodded. His hands were clasped between his knees. He didn't stand up. "The man in the parking lot," she continued. "Same one as before. Your father's operative. He didn't enter the building, but he stood outside Liam's window for an hour. Long enough for a sick teenager to see him, long enough to do the damage without leaving a fingerprint." Caspian's jaw worked. She could see the muscles moving under his skin, grinding, processing. "I'll handle it." "You said that before." "I know." "You said security protocols. You said clearance lists. You said your father couldn't touch him. And tonight my brother collapsed because a man in a suit stared at his window." "Celine, don't." She held up her hand. The gesture was small, but the force behind it was enormous. The compressed authority of a woman who had spent the last 10 hours in a hospital watching the person she loved most in the world fight for his life. "I don't want strategy. I don't want legal terminology. I don't want you to tell me about leverage points and board votes and 9-week timelines. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me that you can keep my brother safe. Not the company, not the merger, my brother." "Mom." Caspian looked at her. Really looked. Not through her, not past her, not with the controlled assessment of a man running calculations. He looked at her the way someone looks at a fire they've started and can't put out. "I don't know," he said. The honesty was brutal. She almost preferred the lies. "Then what good are you?" she said. And the question wasn't rhetorical and it wasn't cruel. It was genuine, desperate. The question of a woman standing at the edge of everything she'd built in the last 2 months and watching it crumble. Caspian stood up, slowly, his bare feet on the cold marble, his wrinkled shirt, his ruined hair. All of it made him look smaller than usual, reduced, like a man who had been stripped of every tool he normally used to navigate the world and was standing before her with nothing but the raw, insufficient fact of himself. "Let me show you something," he said. He walked past her, down the hallway, into his study. She followed, not because she trusted him, but because the alternative was standing alone in a hallway at 6 a.m. with nowhere to go. He opened the safe, the same safe, the one she'd found the amendment in, and pulled out a second envelope. This one was blue. No red tab, no confidential stamp. He handed it to her. Inside were documents, financial documents, transfer authorizations, a trust fund, established 4 days ago, fully funded, irrevocable, naming Liam Vale as the sole beneficiary. $3.2 million, Caspian said. Enough to cover the Novacure trial in its entirety, plus 5 years of post-treatment care, plus a college fund. The trust is independent of Mercer Financial, independent of the merger, independent of me. Even if the company collapses tomorrow, even if my father seizes every asset I own, this money is untouchable. It belongs to your brother. Celine stared at the documents. The numbers blurred. The legal language swam. "When did you do this?" "The day after you found the amendment, while I was in London. I called my private banker from the hotel at 3 a.m. and told him to set it up before markets opened." "Why?" "Because you were right. About all of it. The amendment was the worst version of me. The version my father built. The version that thinks love is something you have to lock down because if you don't, it leaves. And I looked at that version and I hated it. And I realized that the only way to prove I wasn't him, that I'm not Roman Mercer in a younger body, was to do the one thing he would never do. Which is give up control, completely. The trust means you can leave tomorrow, today, right now. Take your brother's funding and walk out the door, and I will have no legal mechanism, no financial leverage, no power of any kind to stop you." He stood there, bare feet, wrinkled shirt, hands empty, eyes open. "I'm giving you the exit," he said. "The one I should have given you from the beginning." Celine held the documents and felt two things simultaneously: a grief-stricken rage at the man who had drafted the amendment, and a devastating, unwanted, structurally unsound tenderness toward the man who had undone it. They were the same man. That was the problem. That was always the problem with Caspian Mercer. The versions of him existed in layers, and you never knew which one you were touching until it was too late. This doesn't fix what you did, she said. I know. This doesn't make the last 6 weeks real retroactively. I know. And this doesn't mean I trust you. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to stay. Not because of a contract, not because of leverage, because... He stopped, swallowed. The sound was audible in the silent study, a click in his throat that telegraphed how much the next words cost. Because I don't know how to do this without you, and I mean this. This. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the room, at the space between them. Being a person, I was getting better at it. With you, I was remembering how. Celine set the trust documents on the desk, pressed her palms flat against the wood, leaned forward, and breathed. She thought about Liam in the hospital bed, about her mother asleep in a plastic chair, about the man who had stood in a parking lot and stared at a window because Roman Mercer had told him to, about the amendment, about the peonies, about the hand on the living room floor. I'll stay, she said, for now. Not for you, for Liam. Because until that trust is fully operational and verified by my own lawyer, so not yours, mine, I'm not leaving my brother's fate in anyone else's hands. That's fair. And the amendment. I want it destroyed, not filed, not archived. Destroyed. Right now. Caspian reached into the safe, pulled out the manila envelope with the red tab, handed it to her. Celine took it to the kitchen, turned on the gas stove, held the envelope over the flame, and watched it burn. The paper caught fast, curling, blackening, orange edges eating through the legalese like truth eating through a lie. Ash fell into the burner grate. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. Caspian stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. When the last scrap of paper dissolved, Celine turned off the stove, washed her hands, and walked past him without a word. She went upstairs, closed her door, lay on the bed with her shoes still on, and stared at the ceiling while the city woke up outside her window. She had stayed. She didn't know if it was the right decision. She was too tired to care. The 3 weeks that followed were the strangest of Celine's life. She and Caspian existed in a new configuration. Not the cold formality of the early weeks, not the tentative warmth that had been building before the amendment, but something else. Something wary. A stripped-down, cautious coexistence, like two people living in a house that had recently survived a fire, still smelling the smoke, still checking the walls for heat. Caspian didn't push. That was the thing that surprised her most. The man who had spent his entire life engineering outcomes, controlling variables, and manipulating circumstances to produce desired results. That man backed off. Completely. He came home. He was present. But he didn't seek her out. Didn't manufacture moments of connection. Didn't buy flowers or leave books on shelves or do any of the small, calculated things that had made the previous weeks feel like a carefully orchestrated courtship. He just existed, quietly, respectfully, like a man serving a sentence he knew he deserved. And Celine, despite every instinct screaming at her to maintain the walls, despite every logical argument for keeping her distance and counting down the remaining months until the contract expired and she could disappear back into her real life, Celine noticed. She noticed him leaving the kitchen light on for her. Not as a gesture. The gesture phase was over, but as a habit. Something his body did without his mind's permission. She noticed him on the phone with the hospital, checking on Liam's progress 3 times a week, speaking to the doctors with a level of medical literacy that meant he'd been researching leukemia treatment protocols in whatever gaps existed between board meetings and merger negotiations. She noticed him sitting alone in the study at midnight, not drinking, not working, just sitting in the dark with the door open, like a man who had closed himself into rooms for so long that he was teaching himself one night at a time to leave them open. It was on one of those nights that she stopped in the doorway. "You can't sleep either," she said. He looked up. "No." "Is it the merger?" "Partly." "And the other part?" He considered the question. She watched him choose honesty the way other people choose to jump from a height. A visible bracing, a held breath, then the leap. "The other part is you. Standing in that kitchen telling me you were staying for your brother, not for me. Which is exactly what I deserved, and which I haven't been able to stop hearing since you said it." Celine leaned against the doorframe. crossed her arms. Good, she said. Good? You should hear it. You should hear it on repeat. Because that's what accountability sounds like. And based on what I've learned about your family, I don't think anyone's ever made you sit with it before. Something moved in his face, not hurt exactly. Recognition. The painful kind. The kind that comes when someone says something true and the truth has edges. You're right, he said. They haven't. Celine stood there for another moment. Then she walked into the study, sat in the chair across from his desk, and said, Tell me about the merger. Where does it stand? He looked at her. She could see the question forming. Shaz, why are you asking? Why are you engaging? Why are you sitting in my study at midnight when you told me this was purely about your brother? But he didn't voice it. He just answered. They talked for an hour about the Ashford deal, the board dynamics, the voting timeline. About Roman's influence? Diminished but not eliminated, operating through proxies and back channels, and the kind of relational debt that accumulates over decades of doing business with people who owe you favors. When Celine finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. Caspian. Yes. I'm not staying for you. I meant that. I know. But I'm not staying against you either. Not anymore. She left, went upstairs, lay in bed, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she fell asleep before midnight. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like ice thinning in early spring, still solid enough to walk on, but translucent now, light coming through from underneath. Then Roman made his move. It happened on a Tuesday. The board vote on the Ashford merger was scheduled for Friday, 4 days out. The legal teams had been working around the clock. Caspian was spending 18-hour days at the office, coming home gray-faced and running on caffeine and willpower. Celine was at the penthouse, reviewing the trust documents with her own lawyer, a woman named Diane Cortez, who charged $400 an hour, which Celine was paying with money she'd saved from her waitressing days, because she refused to let Caspian fund the verification of his own promises. Her phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. Turn on the TV, her mother said. Channel 7, right now. Celine found the remote, turned on the massive screen in the living room that she'd never used because watching television in a room that felt like a museum made her deeply uncomfortable. Channel 7, a press conference, a podium with the Mercer Financial logo, cameras, reporters, and Roman Mercer, standing at the center of it all, looking exactly like what he was, a man about to detonate a bomb in public and call it concern. I come before you today not as a businessman, Roman said, his voice carrying the rehearsed gravity of someone who had practiced the speech in front of a mirror, but as a father. Celine's stomach dropped. Over the past several months, I have watched with growing alarm as my son, Caspian Mercer, has exhibited behavior that I believe reflects a serious deterioration in his capacity to lead this organization. The room on screen was silent. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras clicked. It is with profound sadness that I must reveal the following. My son's recent marriage, a marriage presented to the public as genuine, was in fact a contractual arrangement, a business transaction negotiated in private, designed to manipulate the perception of stability required for the Ashford-Mercer acquisition. The words hit Celine like a physical blow. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her hand gripping the remote so hard the plastic creaked. I have documentation, Roman continued, and held up a folder, cream-colored, heavy paper, identical to the one Celine had signed in that law office on the first night. A legally binding marriage contract specifying terms, duration, financial compensation, and performance expectations. This marriage is a fraud, and the woman at the center of it, Celine Vale, a former waitress from Queens with no connection to the financial world, was paid to participate. He paused. Let the cameras absorb it. Furthermore, I have serious concerns about my son's mental and emotional fitness. His recent decisions, including the unauthorized establishment of a multi-million-dollar trust fund for his wife's family, the dismissal of senior security personnel, and the systematic exclusion of founding board members from key strategic discussions, suggest a pattern of erratic judgment that I believe warrants immediate psychiatric evaluation and the suspension of his authority pending the board vote. Celine couldn't breathe. The air in the penthouse had turned to concrete. On screen, Roman Mercer, 63 years old, white-haired, elegant, monstrous, was dismantling his own son's life in front of the entire country with the calm, measured delivery of a man reading quarterly earnings. She grabbed her phone, called Caspian, straight to voicemail, called again. Voicemail. Texted, "Your father is on TV. He's exposing the contract. He's calling you mentally unstable. Call me." 60 seconds passed. 90. 2 minutes. Her phone rang. "I know," Caspian said. His voice was flat, utterly, terrifyingly flat. Not the controlled flatness of composure, but the blank flatness of someone who has absorbed a blow so total that the nervous system simply stops processing. "Where are you?" "The office. The board is convening an emergency session. Stocks are already moving." "What do we do?" A pause. She heard breathing. Heavy. Labored. The breathing of a man standing in the middle of a demolition. "I don't know." He hung up. The next 6 hours were the worst of Celine's life. The press conference went viral. Every network carried it. Every news site ran it. The marriage contract, somehow leaked in full. Every page, every clause, every clinical term that reduced their relationship to a transaction appeared on every media outlet in the country before dinner. Celine's phone rang without stopping. Numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters, producers, someone from a morning show she'd watched as a kid. She turned the phone off and sat on the floor of the penthouse living room with her back against the couch and her knees pulled to her chest and watched the city darken through the windows while her life came apart in real time. Her mother called from a neighbor's phone at 8 p.m. "There are reporters outside the building. Celine, there are reporters asking about you, asking about Liam. Someone found his medical records. It's on the internet. My son's medical records are on the internet." "Mom, don't talk to anyone. Lock the door. I'm going to..." "Going to what? What can you possibly do? That man's father just went on television and told the world you're a paid actress. He told them about the contract. He told them about us." Patricia's voice wasn't angry. It was hollow. The hollow of a woman who had trusted her daughter and was now standing in an apartment surrounded by reporters and realizing that the trust had been built on a foundation her daughter had never fully disclosed. "You lied to us," Patricia said quietly. "About the marriage. About how the money was arranged. You told me he was a friend, a benefactor." "Mom, is any of it real, Celine? Any of it? Or was this entire year a lie?" The question hung in the air like a blade, and Celine had no answer that wouldn't cut. "I did it for Liam," she said, and the words sounded exactly as hollow as they were, technically true, emotionally bankrupt, the excuse of someone who had made a choice and was only now understanding the full price. "Liam is 17 years old," Patricia said, "and his medical records are on the news because you married a stranger for money." The line went dead. Celine sat on the floor. The penthouse was dark. She hadn't turned on the lights, and the city outside provided only the cold, blue-white glow of a world that was carrying on without her. She pressed her forehead against her knees and breathed. In, out, in, out. The sound was ragged, broken. The breathing of an animal in a trap, not calm, not controlled, just the involuntary mechanics of a body that was going to keep functioning whether the person inside it wanted to or not. Caspian came home at midnight. She heard the elevator, the footsteps, the pause in the hallway, that distinctive Caspian pause, the one where he stood still and assessed the environment before entering, the habit of a man who had been trained since childhood to identify threats before they identified him. He found her on the living room floor. She hadn't moved in 4 hours. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked across the dark room, lowered himself to the floor beside her, and sat, close enough to touch, but not touching. The gap between them was 6 inches and 6 miles. "The board voted to postpone the merger pending an internal review," he said. "Stock dropped 11%. 3 board members issued statements supporting my father's call for a psychological evaluation. 2 resigned." Celine didn't lift her head. "My legal team is preparing a counterstatement. We'll challenge the leak of the contract as a breach of attorney-client privilege. The medical records, Liam's records, that's a HIPAA violation. We can pursue criminal charges." "Criminal charges," Celine said into her knees. "My brother's private medical information is on every screen in the country, and you're talking about criminal charges. It's the legal recourse." "Legal recourse doesn't unring the bell, Caspian. It doesn't put Liam's records back in the file. It doesn't make the reporters leave my mother's building. It doesn't make any of this unhappen. Silence. The city hummed outside. Somewhere far below, a siren wailed and faded. He won, Celine said. He hasn't won. He exposed the contract. He destroyed your reputation. He tanked the merger. He published my brother's medical records. He turned my mother against me. She lifted her head. In the dark, her face was a collection of sharp edges and deep shadows. What exactly is left for him to win? Caspian didn't answer immediately. She watched his profile in the dim light. The rigid jaw, the straight nose, the way his Adam's apple moved when he swallowed. He was sitting perfectly still, but there was a tremor running through him, visible only if you knew where to look. His hands, pressed flat against the floor on either side of his legs, were shaking. You, he said. You're left. He wins if you leave. Maybe I should. The words came out before she could stop them, and they landed in the dark room like a body hitting water. Heavy, sudden, irreversible. Caspian turned his head, looked at her. And in the faint light from the city, she saw his face do something she had never seen it do before. It collapsed. Not dramatically, not with tears or noise. It was internal, structural. The load-bearing walls behind his expression giving way simultaneously, the way a building falls when the foundation cracks. His eyes, those cold, calculating, carefully empty eyes, filled with something raw and liquid and completely ungoverned. Don't, he said, and the word came out broken. One syllable, fractured down the middle. The voice of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for every possible contingency and had never, not once, prepared for the possibility that someone he loved would choose to leave. Caspian. I know I have no right to ask. I know the contract is a joke now. I know the trust gives you independence. I know every rational argument points toward the door, but I'm asking you, not as a businessman, not as a mercer, not as anything except a man who is more terrified right now than he has ever been. Please don't go. Celine looked at him, at this man on the floor, this billionaire with bare feet and shaking hands and a face that had finally, completely, irreversibly broken open. I have to think, she said. I know. I need time. How much? I don't know. Tonight, tomorrow. I don't know. She stood up. Her legs were stiff, her joints aching from 4 hours on a marble floor. She walked toward the stairs, stopped. Your father leaked Liam's medical records, she said without turning around. A 17-year-old with cancer. He put that on television for leverage. Yes. What kind of person does that? Caspian's voice came from the darkness behind her, hollow and ancient and exhausted. The kind of person who made me. Celine climbed the stairs, went to her room, packed her suitcase. She packed methodically, carefully. The way you pack when you know this might be the last time you fold these clothes in this room. She left the Appendix C wardrobe in the closet, every designer dress, every pair of shoes that cost more than her rent, every item that belonged to the fiction of Mrs. Caspian Mercer. She packed only her own things, the worn jeans, the secondhand sweaters, the 3 novels she reread when she was anxious, their spines soft from use. She placed her wedding ring on the nightstand. Then she sat down at the small desk by the window and wrote a letter. She wrote it by hand because some things shouldn't be typed. Some things require the slow, deliberate act of pressing pen to paper, forming each letter individually, feeling the weight of every word as it leaves the body through the fingers. The letter was short. She didn't have the energy for length. When she finished, she folded it, set it on the nightstand beside the ring, and picked up her suitcase. The penthouse was dark, silent. She walked down the stairs, through the hallway, past the kitchen where she'd made pasta for a man who'd never been cooked for, past the living room floor where he'd held her hand, past the study where she'd burned a contract and believed briefly that burning paper could burn away betrayal. The elevator opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed. 47 floors down. Marble lobby. The doorman, who knew her name, who called her Mrs. Mercer, with a warmth that she'd never asked for and didn't deserve, opened the front door. Have a good night, Mrs. Mercer. Goodbye, Thomas. The rain had stopped. Manhattan was slick and glistening, every surface reflecting light, every puddle a mirror showing a sky she couldn't see. Celine stepped onto the sidewalk, her suitcase rolling behind her, and hailed a cab with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been hailing cabs in the city since she was 14 years old. She gave the driver her mother's address in Astoria. The cab pulled away from Blackthorn Financial Tower. She looked back once through the rear window and saw the building rising into the night. Glass and steel and money, 47 stories of everything she was leaving behind. Somewhere on the top floor, a man was sitting alone in the dark. She turned forward. Upstairs, in the bedroom she'd just vacated, the letter sat on the nightstand beside the ring. 4 lines, written in handwriting that shook only slightly. I can't save you and lose my family. I can't love you and survive your father. I don't know if what we had was real, but the pain is. And pain is all I have left to give. S. And in the morning, when Caspian found it, he would read those 4 lines standing in the doorway of an empty room, and for the second time in his life, he would understand what it feels like to hold nothing in a space where everything used to be. But this time, unlike the last time, he would not rebuild himself into stone. This time, he would come apart, completely. And what he chose to do with the wreckage, whether he buried it or built something new, would determine not just his future, but whether either of them survived what Roman Mercer had set in motion. Because the old man wasn't finished. He was just getting started. Caspian found the letter at 6:14 in the morning. He knew the time because he was looking at his watch when he pushed open her bedroom door. A habit, checking the hour, the compulsive timekeeping of a man who had structured his entire existence around schedules and deadlines and the careful partitioning of minutes into productive units. 6:14. He had come upstairs to tell her that his legal team had filed an emergency injunction against the press conference footage, that they had a strategy, that it wasn't over. The bed was made, the closet was open, the designer clothes hung in a neat, untouched row, ghosts of a woman who had never really inhabited them. On the nightstand, the ring, small, platinum, the diamond catching the early light from the window in a way that made it look like it was burning. Next to the ring, the letter. He picked it up, read it once, read it again, read it a third time with his lips moving slightly, as though the words needed to be spoken aloud to become real. I can't save you and lose my family. I can't love you and survive your father. I don't know if what we had was real, but the pain is. And pain is all I have left to give. S. Caspian's hand dropped to his side. The letter hung from his fingers, the paper trembling with a vibration so fine it could have been the building's ventilation system, or it could have been the seismic activity of a man's entire internal architecture failing at once. He stood in the doorway for 4 minutes. He knew this because when he finally moved, his watch read 6:18, and the 4 minutes between the two numbers were a blank, a gap in his consciousness, a stretch of time his mind simply refused to record, as though the operating system that ran Caspian Mercer had encountered an error too fundamental to process and had briefly shut down. When the system came back online, he was sitting on her bed. He didn't remember sitting down. He was just there, on the edge of the mattress, the sheets still carrying the faint scent of the shampoo she used. Something simple, drugstore, nothing expensive, nothing from the curated collection Margaret had stocked in her bathroom. She'd brought her own shampoo because of course she had. Because Celine Vale did not let other people choose the things that touched her skin. He pressed the letter flat against his thigh, smoothed the creases, folded it along the original lines with the precise mechanical care of a man performing surgery on something that was already dead. Then he put the letter in his pocket, left the ring on the nightstand, and walked downstairs. He didn't call her, didn't text, didn't dispatch Margaret or a driver, or any of the intermediaries that his world offered as insulation between himself and direct human contact. He sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd made pasta, the same counter where she'd confronted him about the amendment, the same room where, 8 hours ago, they'd sat together on the floor in the dark while his life burned down around them. He sat there until 7, until 8, until the morning sun filled the penthouse with light that felt aggressive, punishing, the kind of brightness that exposes every flaw in a surface. At 8:22, his phone rang. His assistant. He let it ring. At 8:30, it rang again. His lawyer. He let it ring. At 8:41, it rang a third time. A number he recognized. The direct line of Marcus Webb, the chairman of the Mercer Financial Board, a man who had been his father's closest ally for 30 years, and who now, in the wake of the press conference, held the deciding vote on whether the emergency session would strip Caspian of his authority entirely. He answered, "Marcus? Caspian, where the hell are you? The board is convening at 10. Your father filed a formal motion for your removal as CEO. I have 6 directors demanding a response, and your legal team is telling me you've gone dark. I'm at home. At home. The company is in free fall, and you're at home." My wife left. A pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone expecting a strategic conversation is suddenly confronted with a human one. "Caspian, I'm sorry, but we don't have time for—" She left because my father leaked her brother's medical records. Her brother is 17. He has leukemia. He's in a hospital bed right now, and his private medical information was broadcast on national television because my father decided it was an acceptable cost of doing business. Silence on the other end. "I'll be at the board meeting," Caspian said. 10 o'clock. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something before I walk into that room." The man who stood at that podium yesterday and called himself a concerned father is the same man who had a 17-year-old cancer patient's record stolen and published. He's the same man who sent private investigators to intimidate a family in Queens. He's the same man who manufactured an IRS audit against a retired electrician and his wife to pressure their daughter into compliance. This isn't corporate governance. This is cruelty. And if the board can't tell the difference, then the board deserves whatever my father turns it into. He hung up, set the phone on the counter, looked at his hands. They were steady. For the first time in months, his hands were completely steady. Something had shifted, not healed. He was far from healed, and he knew it. The way you know a bone is broken even before the X-ray confirms it. But the fracture had done something unexpected. It had cracked through the last layer of insulation between who Caspian Mercer pretended to be and who he actually was, and the person underneath, raw, furious, stripped of every defense mechanism he'd spent 36 years constructing, that person was awake now. And that person was done being afraid. He showered, dressed, charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie. The absence of the tie was deliberate, a small conscious refusal to perform, to present the polished version of himself that the boardroom expected. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man with bloodshot eyes and a jaw set hard enough to cut glass. And for the first time in his adult life, he didn't reach for the mask. He left the penthouse at 9:15. Across the river, in a cramped apartment in Astoria, Celine was sitting at her mother's kitchen table. The kitchen was small, familiar. Yellow walls that her father had painted 15 years ago and never repainted. A refrigerator covered in magnets from places the family had never been. Souvenirs from friends, gifts from neighbors, the small geography of a life lived within 10 blocks. The table was scarred oak, too big for the room. A hand-me-down from a grandmother who had believed that a family table should always have room for one more person. Celine sat with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, and her mother sat across from her, and between them was a silence that weighed more than the table. Patricia hadn't spoken since Celine had arrived at 2 in the morning. She'd opened the door, looked at the suitcase, looked at her daughter's face, and stepped aside. No questions, no accusations, just the exhausted resignation of a woman who had been carrying too much for too long and had run out of the energy required to express it. But morning had come, and morning required words. "The reporters are gone," Patricia said. "For now." Mrs. Kowalski from 4B said they left around 5. Someone from the building management called the police. Celine nodded. "Your father's at the hospital with Liam. He went early. He said Liam had a good night. Vitals stable. He ate breakfast." "Good. Is it?" Celine looked at her mother. Patricia's face was hard. Not angry, not anymore, but hard in the way that faces get when the softness has been worn away by too many impacts. The face of a woman who had raised 2 children on an electrician's salary, who had watched one of them get sick and the other one disappear into a world she didn't understand, and who was now sitting in her own kitchen looking at a stranger in her daughter's skin. "Mom, I know it's... Do you? Do you know what it was like to see your son's medical records on the television? Do you know what it was like to have a reporter knock on my door and ask me if my daughter was a paid actress? I'm not a paid actress. Then what are you?" The question was simple and devastating, and Celine had no answer that would survive contact with the truth. I married him so Liam could get the treatment, she said. That was the agreement. 12 months, public appearances. In exchange, full coverage for the Novacure trial. You sold yourself. I made a choice. You made a choice without telling us, without asking. You decided what was best for this family, and you did it alone, and now we're all living inside the consequences. If I told you, you would have said no. Of course I would have said no, because I'm your mother, and no mother in her right mind would let her daughter sell her life to a stranger so her son could... Patricia stopped, pressed her fingers against her eyes. The gesture was violent in its restraint, the way she pushed against her own face, trying to hold something in that wanted desperately to come out. And now? Patricia asked, her voice muffled by her hands. Is the treatment still covered? Yes. He set up a trust fund. Independent, irrevocable. Liam's treatment is secure regardless of what happens to the marriage. Patricia lowered her hands. Her eyes were red but dry. And the marriage? Is that over? Celine stared at her tea. The surface was still. Perfectly still. No tremor, no ripple. Just a flat brown circle reflecting the yellow ceiling above. I don't know, she said. Do you love him? The question hit her in the sternum. She felt it physically. A pressure, a compression, something between a punch and a held breath. I don't know that either. That's not good enough, Celine. I know it's not. Then figure it out. Because your brother's in a hospital and your father is terrified and I am sitting in this kitchen trying to understand how my daughter ended up on the news, and I don't know is not an answer. It's an excuse. Celine looked at her mother and felt something crack. Not break, crack. The way ice cracks when the weight on it shifts. The crack ran through the center of everything she'd been holding together for the past 3 months. And through it, she could feel the cold, rushing truth of what she'd done. She had lied to her family. She had traded her autonomy for money. She had walked into a cage and then, against every rational instinct, against every warning sign, against the literal evidence of a hidden contract designed to trap her, she had started to fall for the man holding the key. And now she was sitting in her mother's kitchen in Astoria with a suitcase in the hallway and nowhere to go but forward. I'm going to fix this, she said. How? I don't know yet, but I will. Patricia looked at her for a long time. Then she reached across the table, took Celine's hand, and squeezed. Once. Hard. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to it. The muscular memory of a mother's love, still functional, still operative, even when everything built on top of it was damaged. Your father wants to see you, Patricia said. He's at Mount Sinai, room 412. I'll go. Go now, before you lose your nerve. Celine left the apartment and took the subway to the hospital. The train was crowded, morning rush, bodies pressed together, the underground smell of metal and sweat and coffee. She stood holding a pole, her suitcase between her feet, and nobody looked at her twice. In Queens, on the 7 train at 9 in the morning, she was nobody. Anonymous. Invisible. It was the most comfortable she'd felt in 3 months. At Mount Sinai, she found her father in the hallway outside Liam's room. Frank Vale was 61 years old, built like a man who had spent 40 years working with his hands. Thick forearms, broad shoulders, a face that had been handsome once and was now weathered into something more interesting. His hair was gray. His eyes were the same color as Celine's, dark brown, almost black, the kind of eyes that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. He was holding a coffee. His hands were steady. Frank Vale's hands were always steady. That was the thing about him. The thing Celine had loved most and understood least. Her father existed in a state of fundamental calm that seemed to operate independent of circumstance. Liam's diagnosis hadn't broken it. The financial pressure hadn't broken it. Even the press conference, the reporters, the exposure of every private detail of their family's struggle, even that hadn't broken it. He looked at her, didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked, the way he looked at everything, directly, without pretense, without the elaborate emotional choreography that most people performed when confronted with difficult situations. Hey kid, he said. Hey dad. You look like hell. Thanks. He handed her his coffee. She took it. Drank. It was terrible. Hospital vending machine coffee, bitter and lukewarm, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in days. "Your mother called," he said. "Told me you came home." "Yeah." "Told me the marriage was a deal for Liam's treatment." "Yeah." Frank nodded, slow, the nod of a man processing information at his own pace, not the world's. "Smart move," he said. Celine blinked. "What?" "I said smart move. Not a good move, not a moral move, but smart. You saw a problem, you found a solution, and you paid the price yourself instead of asking anyone else to carry it." He paused. "That's what I would have done." "Mom doesn't see it that way." "Your mother sees it exactly that way. She's just furious that you didn't let her help carry it." Celine leaned against the wall. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped in steady rhythm, and the sound was so familiar now, so deeply embedded in the soundtrack of the last year of her life, that she barely registered it. "Dad, I messed up." "Yeah, you did." "I fell for him." Frank looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, not judgment, recognition, the recognition of a man who had once been young and stupid and reckless with his own heart. "Is he worth it?" he asked. "I don't know." "That's the wrong answer." "I know. The right answer is either yes or no, and if you can't say it, then you already know which one it is and you're too scared to admit it." Celine looked at her father, this quiet, steady man with his terrible coffee and his calloused hands and his brutal, devastating simplicity, and felt the truth rise through her like a flood. "Yes," she said, "he's worth it. He's broken and dangerous, and he has no idea how to love someone without hurting them. And yes, he's worth it." Frank took the coffee back, drank, set the cup on the windowsill. "Then go get him," he said. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. The hard part you already did. The hard part was admitting it to yourself in a hospital hallway at 9 in the morning while your kid brother is 20 feet away hooked up to machines. Everything after this is just logistics." He put his hand on her shoulder, squeezed. His grip was strong, electrician's grip. The grip of a man who had spent his life connecting things, wiring circuits, closing gaps between power sources and the devices that needed them. "Go," he said. "I've got Liam. Your mother will come around. Go do what you need to do." Celine looked at the door to Liam's room. Through the small window, she could see her brother, asleep, thin, his chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of a body resting between battles. She pressed her hand against the glass, held it there for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked. The Mercer Financial Building was a monument of glass and ambition on 53rd Street, and Celine arrived at 9:58, 2 minutes before the emergency board meeting that would decide whether Caspian Mercer remained CEO of the company his family had built over 3 generations. She didn't have clearance. She didn't have an appointment. She had a suitcase from Astoria, yesterday's clothes, and the absolute, irreducible certainty that she was about to walk into a room full of people who either wanted to destroy the man she loved or were too afraid of his father to stop it from happening. The lobby security recognized her. Of course they did. Her face had been on every news channel in the country for the last 18 hours. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm not sure. I'm going up. Ma'am, the board meeting is restricted access. I'm his wife." The words came out hard, flat, and final. Not a claim of ownership, but a declaration of position, the verbal equivalent of planting a flag. The security guard looked at her face, looked at the suitcase, looked at something in her eyes that apparently exceeded his pay grade to argue with, and stepped aside. She took the elevator to 32. The doors opened onto a corridor she recognized, the same corridor she'd stormed through weeks ago in her pajamas, past the same assistant, past the same glass walls. But the energy was different now. The floor hummed with the particular frequency of institutional crisis. People moving faster than normal, voices lower than normal, the collective body language of an organization that could feel the ground shifting under its feet. The boardroom was at the end of the hall. Glass walls, mercifully frosted for privacy. Through the translucent panels, Celine could see shapes. Seated figures around a long table, standing figures at the head. The door was closed. She could hear voices. Muffled but audible. One of them was Caspian's, low, controlled. The voice she'd heard negotiate terms and deliver bad news and whisper things in the dark that he'd never said to another living person. The other voice was Roman's, higher, sharper, carrying the particular edge of a man who believed he was winning and wanted everyone in the room to know it. Celine set her suitcase against the wall, straightened her coat, pushed her hair behind her ears with both hands, a nervous habit from childhood, the gesture she made when she was about to do something that scared her. She opened the door. 14 people sat around the table, 12 board members, plus Caspian at one end and Roman at the other. A court reporter sat in the corner. 2 lawyers flanked Roman like bookends. The room smelled like coffee and aggression. Every head turned. Roman saw her first. His face registered surprise. A brief, controlled flicker, there and gone, replaced immediately by the smooth, paternal mask he wore like a second skin. Caspian saw her second, and the look on his face, the raw, unguarded, completely unmanaged shock that broke across his features like dawn through a window. That look told Celine everything she needed to know about whether what they'd had was real. Nobody fakes that. Nobody performs surprise at that depth. His lips parted. His hands, flat on the table, curled slightly. His entire body shifted toward her, an involuntary gravitational response, the way a plant turns toward light without deciding to. "This is a closed session," Roman said. His voice was ice, polished. "Mrs. Mercer, or should I say Miss Vale, this meeting is restricted to board members and authorized." "I'm authorized," Celine said. "I'm a stakeholder in this company's future, and I'm the woman your son married, and I have something to say." She walked to the table, didn't sit, stood at the midpoint, equidistant between father and son, and looked at the 12 faces arranged around the polished wood. These were powerful people. She could feel it, the weight of their wealth, their influence, their accumulated decades of making decisions that moved markets and shaped industries. They wore their power in their posture, their clothes, the casual confidence of people who had never stood in a hospital hallway wondering how to pay for their brother's next round of treatment. She was terrified. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Her palms were slick. Her mouth was dry. She spoke anyway. "My name is Celine Vale. You know that already, because yesterday my name and my face and my brother's medical records were broadcast on national television by the man sitting at the end of this table." Roman's expression didn't change. He sat perfectly still, legs crossed, hands folded, watching her with the detached curiosity of a man observing an insect. "Everything Mr. Mercer said at that press conference was technically true. I did sign a contract. I was compensated. The marriage was arranged. Those are facts, and I won't insult your intelligence by denying them." She paused, breathed. The room was silent. The silence of 14 people who had expected a corporate proceeding and were getting a confession instead. But here's what wasn't in that press conference. What Mr. Mercer didn't tell you is that he sent private investigators to follow my family. He manufactured a fraudulent IRS audit against my parents. He created a fake oversight committee to access my brother's hospital room. He sent a man to stand in a parking lot outside Mount Sinai and stare at my brother's window until a 17-year-old cancer patient had a stress-induced collapse. And then he stole my brother's protected medical records and published them for the entire country to see. She could feel her voice shaking. She didn't try to stop it. The shake was real, and real was the only currency she had left. He did all of this not because he cares about this company, not because he has concerns about his son's mental health. He did it because Caspian fell in love with me, and Roman Mercer believes that love makes people weak, and he would rather destroy his own son than allow him to become something other than what Roman built him to be. Roman unfolded his hands. Slowly. The gesture was deliberate, theatrical, the movement of a man preparing to speak from a position of absolute authority. "Miss Vale," he said, and the use of her maiden name was a weapon, precise and intentional. "This is a deeply emotional speech. But emotion is not evidence. You're asking this board to take the word of a woman who, by her own admission, entered a fraudulent marriage for financial gain. Your credibility." "My credibility is not on trial," Celine said. "Yours is." Roman's eyes narrowed. The first crack in the mask, not large but visible, a micro-contraction around the corners of his eyes, the faintest tightening of his jaw. He was not accustomed to being interrupted. "I have documentation," Celine continued. The text message from the untraceable phone, the security footage from Mount Sinai showing your operative in the parking lot, phone records from the fake oversight committee that trace back to a shell company registered to your personal attorney, and a sworn statement from Diane Cortez, my independent legal counsel, confirming that the trust fund Caspian established for my brother's treatment was created voluntarily, without coercion, and at significant personal financial cost. The exact opposite of the behavior you'd expect from a man who's mentally unstable. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a flash drive, set it on the table. The sound it made, about small, plastic, insignificant, was somehow louder than anything else in the room. Everything is on there, every piece of it, verified, documented, ready for legal review. Roman looked at the flash drive. Then he looked at his son. Caspian hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He sat at his end of the table, hands still flat on the surface, watching Celine with an expression that defied categorization. Not gratitude, not pride, not love, but some alchemical combination of all three, forged under extreme pressure into something entirely new. "This is theater," Roman said. His voice was still controlled, but the control was costing him now. She could hear the effort, the slight strain at the edges, the first indicators that the smooth, paternal performance was requiring more energy than he'd budgeted. A distraction from the fundamental issue, which is my son's fitness to lead this. "Mr. Mercer," the voice came from the middle of the table. Marcus Webb, the chairman, a heavy-set man in his 60s with silver hair and the face of someone who had been doing the math throughout this entire exchange and had arrived at a number he didn't like. "Mr. Mercer, I'd like to examine the contents of that drive before we proceed." "Marcus, it's due diligence, Roman, something you taught me yourself." The room shifted. Celine felt it. A tectonic adjustment, subtle but seismic, the collective weight of the board recalibrating. Not a decision, not yet, but a crack in the assumption that Roman Mercer was the reasonable party in this room. Roman felt it too. His posture changed, a fractional stiffening, the slight backward lean of a man who has been leaning forward confidently and suddenly realizes the ground beneath him is not as solid as he thought. "I welcome scrutiny," Roman said. Smiled. The smile was perfect, warm, open, paternal. The smile of a man who had been lying professionally for 63 years and had elevated it to an art form. "I have nothing to hide." "Then you won't mind if we adjourn for an hour to review the material," Marcus said. "Legal can authenticate the documents. We'll reconvene at 11. Roman's smile held, but his eyes, those pale, predatory eyes that were the same color as his son's and carried none of the same damage. His eyes went flat. "Of course," he said. The board filed out. Lawyers huddled. Someone took the flash drive to a conference room down the hall. Celine stood at the table, her coat still on, her hands at her sides, and watched the room empty until only she and Caspian remained. He stood up, slowly, like a man whose body had forgotten how to perform the action and was relearning it in real time. "You came back," he said. "I came back." "Why?" "Because my father told me to stop being an idiot." Something happened to Caspian's face, a contortion, a spasm, the muscular precursor to an expression he hadn't made in so long that his face struggled to produce it. He laughed, short, rough, broken at the edges. Not a happy laugh, a laugh of release, of pressure escaping, of a man who had been holding his breath for so long that the simple act of exhaling felt like an explosion. "Your father," he said. "My father. The retired electrician who your father tried to audit into submission." Celine took a step closer. "He told me that the hard part was admitting to myself that you're worth it. He said everything after that is logistics." "And am I? Worth it?" She looked at him, at this man in his charcoal suit with no tie, at his bloodshot eyes and his bare ring finger and the faint tremor in his hands that he was no longer trying to hide. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me again after we survive today." He nodded. And then he did something she didn't expect. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out her letter, unfolded it, set it on the table between them. "You wrote that the pain is all you have left to give," he said. "I remember what I wrote." "You were wrong. Pain isn't all you have. You just walked into a boardroom and dismantled my father in front of 14 people with a flash drive and the truth. That's not pain, that's power. Celine picked up the letter, folded it, put it in her own pocket. It's both, she said. The hour passed, the board reconvened. And when they filed back into the room, the atmosphere had changed so completely that it was like walking into a different building. Marcus Webb's face told the story. The chairman sat down heavily, placed the flash drive in front of him, and looked at Roman Mercer with an expression that Celine recognized from her childhood, the expression her mother wore when she found out someone had been lying to her. Not anger, disappointment. The cold, structural disappointment that comes when someone you trusted reveals themselves to be less than what you believed. The documents are authentic, Marcus said. The shell company traces back to your personal attorney's office. The hospital security footage is time-stamped and verified. The phone records are real. Roman's posture didn't change. His face didn't change. He sat at his end of the table like a statue. Perfect, composed, carved from something that had never been alive. These are allegations, he said, easily manufactured. The technology exists to... Roman, Marcus's voice dropped. Stop. The word landed in the room like a gunshot. Every board member flinched. Roman's mouth closed. I've known you for 31 years, Marcus continued. I built my career alongside yours. I defended you when the board questioned your methods. I voted with you when others hesitated. And now I'm looking at evidence that you targeted a teenage cancer patient's medical records to win a corporate power struggle. He paused. The room was so quiet that Celine could hear the ventilation system. A low, constant hum, the mechanical breathing of a building that didn't care about the humans inside it. I'm calling for a vote, Marcus said. Not on Caspian's fitness, on yours. Specifically, a motion to permanently remove Roman Mercer from the board of directors of Mercer Financial, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into the conduct described in these documents. Roman stood up. The motion was sudden, not violent, but charged, carrying the compressed energy of a man who had spent 6 decades occupying the highest seat in every room he entered and had never, not once, been asked to leave one. You can't do this, he said. His voice was still controlled, but the control was fracturing now. Hairline cracks spiderwebbing through the surface, the first signs of structural failure. I built this company. Every brick, every contract, every relationship in this room exists because of me. That may be true, Marcus said, but relationships built on intimidation have a shelf life, and yours just expired. Roman turned to his son. Caspian sat motionless at the opposite end of the table, his hand still flat on the surface, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, father and son looked at each other directly. The air between them was charged, toxic. The accumulated voltage of 36 years of manipulation, grief, control, and the slow, systematic destruction of every human impulse that Roman Mercer had ever identified in his son and attempted to eliminate. Caspian. Roman's voice changed, softened. The paternal warmth returned, manufactured, desperate, the reflexive weapon of a man reaching for the tool that had always worked before. You know I did this for you. Everything I've done has been for you, to make you strong, to make you ready. This company is your legacy, and I was protecting it from... From what? Caspian's voice was quiet, almost gentle. And the gentleness was worse than any shout could have been, because it came from a place so deep and so certain that it didn't need volume to carry. From the woman who bandaged my hand at 2 a.m, from the person who made me pasta when I forgot to eat, from the first human being in 8 years who made me feel like the world had something in it besides quarterly earnings and grief. He stood up, walked around the table, slowly, passing each board member, each seat, each person who had watched this family destroy itself in real time. He stopped 3 feet from his father. They were the same height, the same build, the same pale eyes. Looking at them together was like looking at a mirror that showed time. One face aged by years and cruelty, the other aged by years and sorrow, both carrying the same bone structure and the same capacity for damage. You told me after Evelyn died that her death was an opportunity, Caspian said. You told me that love was a vulnerability. You told me that the strongest version of myself was the one that felt nothing. Roman's jaw tightened. You were wrong. The strongest version of myself is the one that feels everything and chooses to keep going anyway. And the woman standing in this room, The woman you called a paid fraud, the woman whose family you terrorized, the woman who just walked into your boardroom and took you apart with nothing but the truth. She taught me that. Caspian turned to Marcus. Call the vote. Marcus nodded. All in favor of removing Roman Mercer from the board of directors, effective immediately. One hand went up, then another, then 6, then 9. 12 hands, unanimous. Roman Mercer stood in the boardroom he had built, surrounded by people he had controlled for decades, and watched every hand in the room rise against him. His face didn't crumble. It froze. The mask didn't crack. It calcified, hardened into something permanent. The final expression of a man who had just watched his entire world vote him out of existence. He looked at Caspian, at Celine, at the raised hands, at the flash drive sitting on the table like a small plastic tombstone. You'll regret this, he said. Not to anyone in particular. To the room, to the air, to the future. Then he walked out. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, sharp, rhythmic, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who still believed, even in defeat, that the ground existed to carry him and only him. The boardroom door swung closed. Silence. Then Marcus exhaled, a long, heavy breath. The breath of a man setting down something he'd been carrying for decades, and said, Motion carries. The Ashford merger vote will proceed as scheduled on Friday. Caspian, you have the floor. But Caspian wasn't looking at Marcus. He was looking at Celine. And Celine was looking at him. And the distance between them, 6 feet of boardroom carpet, a table, the wreckage of 2 families, and the still smoking remains of every lie and truth and contract and confession that had brought them to this exact point. That distance, for the first time, felt like something that could be crossed. Not easily, not cleanly, not without more pain and more honesty and more of the brutal, unglamorous work of 2 damaged people learning to trust each other in a world that had given them every reason not to. But crossable. Definitely crossable. Celine stood in the boardroom, the flash drive on the table, her letter in her pocket, and her heart doing something it hadn't done in weeks, beating without fear. And then her phone buzzed. She glanced down. A text from the hospital, from Liam's direct number, the phone they'd given him in his room so he could reach family. Sis, turn on the news. Dad says Roman Mercer just gave another press conference in the lobby. He's saying Caspian threatened him. He's saying the board vote was coerced. He has reporters everywhere. Celine looked up, met Caspian's eyes, watched the fragile, hard-won piece that had settled over his face for exactly 45 seconds, shatter like glass thrown against concrete. Roman Mercer had walked out of the boardroom, but he hadn't walked away. He had walked downstairs, found the nearest camera, and fired the next shot before the smoke from the last one had cleared. And this time, he wasn't fighting for control of a company. He was fighting to make sure that if he couldn't have his son, nobody could. The lobby of Mercer Financial was a cathedral of glass and marble, and Roman Mercer stood at its center like a man who had confused the building for an altar and himself for something worth worshiping. Celine saw it on the elevator's security monitor as she and Caspian descended. A live feed from the lobby cameras showing Roman positioned behind an improvised podium of stacked press microphones, his white hair catching the overhead lights, his posture immaculate, his face arranged into the precise configuration of a grieving father forced into public action by his conscience. 12 reporters, 4 cameras. 2 satellite trucks visible through the lobby windows, parked on the street outside with their antennas raised like mechanical fingers pointing at the sky. Roman had made 1 phone call. 1. In the time it took the board to vote him out, he had summoned the press, composed his narrative, and staged a counteroffensive in the building's own lobby. The speed of it told Celine everything about the kind of man they were dealing with. Not someone who improvised under pressure, but someone who had contingency plans layered so deep that defeat was simply the trigger for the next phase. He planned this, Celine said, watching the monitor, before the board meeting even started. He knew how the vote might go, and he had this ready. Caspian stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the screen. His jaw was set. His hands were in his pockets, and she could see the fabric moving over his knuckles, the fists he was making without realizing it. The involuntary clenching of a man watching his father turn humiliation into ammunition in real time. He always plans it, Caspian said. Every exit has a secondary entrance. Every loss has a preloaded retaliation. That's how he operates. That's how he's always operated. So what do we do? The elevator reached the lobby level. The doors opened. Through the glass partition separating the elevator bank from the main floor, they could see Roman mid-sentence, his voice carrying the warm, manufactured gravitas of a man who had spent 63 years learning how to make lies sound like paternal concern. Removed from my own boardroom by my own son, under circumstances that I can only describe as deeply troubling, the influence of outside parties, Caspian stepped forward. Celine caught his arm. "Wait," she said. "He's lying to the entire—" "I know, wait." He looked at her. The fury in his face was incandescent, bright, hot, the kind of anger that burns white and leaves nothing behind. But beneath it, she could see the old pattern reasserting itself, the pattern his father had installed in him since childhood. Threat appears. React with force. Control the outcome. Dominate the room. That pattern was Roman's operating system. And every time Caspian ran it, he became exactly what his father built him to be. "If you go out there angry, you're playing his game," Celine said. "He wants you to storm that podium. He wants footage of you looking unhinged. That's the whole point of this. It's like to provoke you into becoming the version of yourself that proves his narrative right." "Then what do you suggest? We stand here and let him—" "We don't storm. We walk together, calmly, and we tell the truth. Not his version. Not the cleaned-up version. The actual truth. All of it." Caspian stared at her. She watched the war behind his eyes, the Mercer instinct fighting the new thing, the fragile, half-built thing that she had helped him construct over the past 3 months. The thing that didn't have a name yet because naming it would make it real, and making it real would make it something Roman could target. "Everything," he said. "Everything. The contract, the reasons. What happened after. What your father did to my family. What you did with the amendment. What I did when I left. All of it. Because the only weapon your father doesn't know how to fight is the truth delivered without shame." Caspian was quiet for 5 seconds. 10. The lobby hummed beyond the glass partition. Roman's voice continued, smooth and confident, building his case with the practiced fluency of a man who had been constructing realities for other people his entire life. "Okay," Caspian said. "Okay? Okay." Together. He offered his hand. Not dramatically, just extended it, palm up, between them. The gesture was simple, almost tentative, and it carried a question that went far beyond the next 5 minutes. Celine took it. They walked through the glass partition and into the lobby. The first reporter saw them. Then a second. Then the entire press contingent turned, cameras swiveling, and the combined attention of 12 journalists and 4 broadcast networks focused on 2 people walking side by side across a marble floor, holding hands, looking nothing like a billionaire CEO and his contractual wife, and everything like 2 people who had decided, in the space of an elevator ride, to stop performing and start being real. Roman saw them. His sentence trailed off. For the first time in the entire ordeal, the press conference, the board meeting, the months of psychological warfare, Celine saw genuine surprise on his face, not the manufactured flicker he deployed as a social tool. Real surprise. The surprise of a man who had calculated every possible response to his maneuver and had not, in any scenario, anticipated this. His son and the woman he'd tried to destroy walking toward him hand in hand with calm on their faces and truth on their tongues. "Caspian," Roman began. "We'd like to make a statement," Caspian said. Not to his father. To the press. His voice was even, measured, and utterly devoid of the aggression that Roman had been trying to provoke. "If you'll give us a moment." The reporters shifted, microphones redirected. Roman stood at the podium with his hands resting on its edges, and Celine watched his knuckles go white, the only visible sign that the man behind the mask was scrambling. Caspian didn't approach the podium. He stopped 10 feet away, in the open floor of the lobby, with Celine beside him and no barrier between them and the cameras. No podium. No prepared statement. No shield. "My father told you our marriage was a fraud," Caspian said. "He's partially right. It started as a contract, a business arrangement. I needed a wife to satisfy conservative stakeholders ahead of a major acquisition, and Celine needed funding for her brother's cancer treatment. The terms were clear: 12 months. Public appearances. No personal involvement." He paused. The lobby was silent except for the soft whir of cameras. What my father didn't tell you, what he couldn't tell you because it doesn't fit his narrative, is what happened next. What happened is that I fell in love with the woman I married. Not because of the contract, in spite of it. And I handled that badly. I made mistakes, serious ones. I drafted a secret amendment designed to keep her from leaving because I was too afraid to just tell her the truth. When she found it, she confronted me, and she was right to be furious, and I deserved every word she said. Celine felt his hand tighten around hers, not squeezing for comfort, holding on. The way you hold on to something when the ground beneath you is giving way and you've decided you'd rather fall with someone than stand alone. My father also told you he has concerns about my mental fitness. What he didn't tell you is that his method of expressing that concern involved sending investigators to follow Celine's family, manufacturing a fraudulent IRS audit against her parents, creating a fake committee to infiltrate her brother's hospital room, and ultimately stealing and publishing the private medical records of a 17-year-old leukemia patient, a sick child, as a tactical weapon in a corporate power struggle. A murmur ran through the reporters. The sound was quiet, a collective intake of breath, the rustle of people recalibrating. I am not mentally unstable, Caspian said. I am angry. I am exhausted. And I am standing here telling you the truth about my own family because the alternative my father prefers, is to keep the ugliness hidden and let it fester. And I've spent 36 years doing that, and I'm done. He looked at Roman. The old man stood behind the podium, motionless, his face locked in an expression that had passed through surprise and settled into something colder. Calculation. The rapid internal math of a man searching for the angle, the leverage, the weakness in what was being said. I love my father, Caspian said, and the words visibly cost him. Celine felt his hand tremble, felt the muscles in his forearm contract. I have spent my entire life trying to earn something from him that I now understand he doesn't have to give. Not because he's incapable of love, but because he decided a long time ago that love was a tool to be used rather than a thing to be felt. And that decision shaped me in ways I'm still trying to undo. He turned back to his cameras. The board of Mercer Financial voted unanimously today to remove my father from his position. That vote was not coerced. It was not the result of outside influence. It was the result of documented evidence showing a pattern of intimidation, fraud, and abuse of power that this company can no longer afford to ignore. He stopped, breathed. The sound was audible. The shaky, imperfect breathing of a man who had just said the hardest things he'd ever said in front of the largest audience he'd ever addressed. Then Celine spoke. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to stand beside him, hold his hand, be present, but the words came up from somewhere below planning, below strategy, below the careful management of appearance and outcome that had governed every minute of her life since she'd signed that contract in the law office. I'm Celine, she said. I'm from Queens. My brother has leukemia. I married a man I didn't know to save my brother's life. And I'd do it again tomorrow, because that's what you do when someone you love is dying, and you have one option, and it's sitting across from you in a conference room. She looked at the cameras, looked through them, spoke to the people she couldn't see, the ones watching at home, the ones who would read about this tomorrow, the ones who would form opinions and make judgments based on whatever story the headlines chose to tell. Was it a transaction? Yes. Was it also eventually something more? Yes. Do I understand if you judge me for it? Yes. But I'd rather be judged for the truth than praised for a lie. And the truth is that I love the man standing next to me, and he loves me. And the road that brought us here was ugly and messy and nothing like the fairy tale version anyone wants to hear. That's all I have. Take it or leave it. The lobby was quiet for 3 full seconds after she finished. Then the questions started. A barrage. A flood. Voices overlapping. Recorders thrust forward. The chaotic hunger of a press corps that smelled blood and story in equal measure. Celine didn't answer them. Neither did Caspian. They turned together. A coordinated motion, not rehearsed, but synchronized in the way that only happens when 2 people have been through enough together to share an instinct, and walked back toward the elevator. Roman's voice followed them. Caspian. They stopped. Celine felt Caspian's entire body react to the sound of his father's voice. A full body flinch, suppressed immediately, but present, the conditioned response of a child who had learned that his father's voice preceded either punishment or withdrawal. He turned. Roman had stepped away from the podium. He stood alone now, the reporters behind him, the cameras still rolling, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, the mask was gone. Not cracked, not